He told her to leave within the first 5 minutes. Not with anger, with the quiet certainty of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to end things. She was too young, too unknown, too far outside the world that Whitcombe Estate had always belonged to. Eleanor Whitfield set down her cases, straightened her coat, and said, "The East Garden has 18 months of unchecked growth destroying a 2-century-old design. I suggest we discuss my leaving after you decide whether the garden can wait." The silence that followed told her everything. He did not tell her to leave again. Before we subscribe to the Duke's Diary and stay until the very end of this story. Tell me in the comments which city you are watching from. I want to know how far this story has traveled. The servants at Whitcombe Estate had been preparing Eleanor for Nathaniel Whitcombe since the carriage had turned through the estate gates. It had begun with the coachman who had offered without being asked that the master was a man of precise expectations and limited patience. The housekeeper, Mrs. Aldrin, a woman of perhaps 60, with the posture of someone who had learned to carry authority without displaying it, had met Eleanor at the entrance and conducted her through the main hall with the brisk efficiency of someone who believed that useful information was best delivered quickly. "His Grace is not unkind," Mrs. Aldrin had said, which Eleanor had noted was not the same as saying he was kind. "He is particular. He expects things done correctly and does not require explanation of why they were done incorrectly. He notices details most employers would not. He does not forget them." A pause at the door to the east corridor. "He does not often engage with staff beyond what the work requires. If he speaks to you directly, it is significant. If he does not speak to you at all, it is not personal." "And if he tells me to leave?" Eleanor had asked. Mrs. Aldrin had looked at her with the careful expression of someone revising an initial assessment. "He has told 3 previous contractors to leave," she said. 2 went immediately. The 3rd argued and was still asked to go only with a formal letter afterward explaining the specific deficiencies in his work. She had paused. "I suppose the question is which sort of person you are." Eleanor had thought about the 6 weeks of preparation that had gone into this commission, the research into Whitcombe Estate's history, the sourcing of reference materials on Victorian garden design, the careful packing of tools and supplies, the arrangement of her other work around this particular absence. She had thought about what the commission would mean for her practice if she completed it well, and she had thought about the letter of engagement signed by Nathaniel Whitcombe's estate manager, which was a legally binding document. "The sort who has a contract," she had said. Mrs. Aldrin had almost smiled. The almost smile Eleanor had come to understand by the end of her first hour at Whitcombe Estate was a currency of considerable value among people who lived and worked in the presence of Nathaniel Whitcombe. It indicated approval without requiring the vulnerability of expressing it. She would learn in the weeks ahead that the master of the house was fluent in the same language. Whitcombe Estate presented itself in layers. The first layer, the one visible from the carriage approach, was impressive in the way that things built to impress always were: a long gravel drive bordered by old oak trees, a facade of pale stone with tall windows that caught the morning light, a formal entrance with the proportions of something designed to communicate permanence. It was the architectural equivalent of a carefully maintained reputation. Seen from the correct distance at the correct angle, it suggested that everything inside was in equally fine order. Eleanor had learned years ago not to trust the view from the carriage window. The second layer of Whitcombe Estate revealed itself as she worked through the interior on her first afternoon, guided by Mrs. Aldrin through the rooms she would be assessing for restoration. The staterooms were maintained. The library was in good order. The dining room was formal and correct, and entirely without warmth, like a stage set waiting for a production that had not yet been scheduled. But between those maintained spaces were the other rooms. Doors that were closed, not because they were locked, but because no one had decided what to do with them yet. Furniture draped in cotton covers. Rooms where the light was different from the rooms beside them because the curtains had not been opened, not today, or perhaps for considerably longer than today. A house that had been cared for without being lived in. She had seen this before, not always in houses. In documents and garden designs in old estate records, the specific difference between something that had been preserved and something that was being used. Preservation was not the same as life. Preservation was the refusal of change. Life required the willingness to let things become what they were going to become. The estate's third layer was the garden. She had seen it from the carriage window, and her assessment had been immediate and accurate. The east parterre was overtaken. Yes, but the bones of it were still there beneath the unchecked growth. The original design, formal, geometric, the kind of garden that required sustained attention to maintain its precision, had not been destroyed. It had been abandoned. There was a difference. Destruction left wreckage. Abandonment left potential. She was very good at the difference between the two. What she had not seen from the carriage window was the western section of the grounds which Mrs. Aldrin had not included in the initial tour, and which Eleanor had only found by following an overgrown path from the stable yard on her first independent exploration of the estate that afternoon. The path ended at a gate, and the gate opened onto what had clearly once been a private garden of considerable beauty. It was not overgrown. That was the first thing she noticed. Unlike the east parterre, unlike every other neglected section of the estate she had encountered, this garden was tended. Not formally, not with the precision of professional maintenance, but someone had been cutting back the worst of the encroachment. Someone had been keeping the central path clear. A climbing rose along the far wall had been trained recently by hands that understood what they were doing. She stood at the gate and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at the shape of the garden beneath its present condition. The original planting plan still visible in the organization of what remained, the deliberate arrangement of what had been allowed to grow where. And she thought, this is not a forgotten garden. This is a garden someone is waiting to be ready for. She did not ask Mrs. Aldrin about it that evening. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that required more information before they could be understood correctly. Nathaniel Whitcombe did not appear at dinner on Eleanor's first evening. This was not, according to Mrs. Aldrin, unusual. The master dined in his study when he was working through estate business, which was frequently. He preferred, the housekeeper explained without particular editorial, to organize his evenings around the demands of the work rather than the social conventions of meal structure. Eleanor ate in a small room off the main dining room that she understood was neither the servants' hall nor the formal dining space. A middle arrangement that communicated something about her position at the estate that she chose not to examine too carefully at the end of a long first day. The food was good. The room was warm. The window looked out onto the kitchen garden, which was in considerably better condition than the ornamental grounds, which told her that practicality was valued here over aesthetics. That was useful information. She went to bed early and lay awake for approximately 40 minutes, cataloging what she had observed. The estate was larger than the commission materials had indicated. The garden restoration would take the full 3 months and would require additional materials that she had not anticipated. There was something significant about the western garden that she did not yet understand. The housekeeper was a woman of considerable intelligence who had decided on limited evidence to offer Eleanor a form of conditional support. The estate manager was competent and thorough, and had she suspected, been the one to find her name and recommend the engagement before Nathaniel Whitcombe had reviewed it directly. And the master of the house was not what she had expected. She had expected, based on Mrs. Aldrin's careful description and the general category of wealthy, powerful man who required everything done correctly, and noticed when it was not someone who communicated primarily through imposition. A man whose authority was felt as weight in a room. What she had encountered in that entrance hall exchange was different. Nathaniel Whitcombe did not impose. He simply occupied space with total conviction, as though the arrangement of the world around him was a natural consequence of his being in it, not something he required effort to maintain. He had looked at her with the kind of attention that was actually attention, not the assessment of someone cataloging her inadequacies, but the attention of someone who was genuinely trying to determine what he was looking at. And when she had not left at his suggestion, he had not insisted. That was the detail she kept returning to as she lay in the unfamiliar room, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an unfamiliar house settling into its nighttime self. He had told her she could go. She had indicated politely, but without any particular deference, that she intended to stay. And he had, after a pause that she had observed contained something she would tentatively classify as genuine surprise, turned and walked toward his study and said over his shoulder, "Mrs. Aldrin will show you your rooms. The assessment may begin tomorrow. I will expect a preliminary report by Friday. She had been in the entrance hall for 9 minutes at that point. She had not been told to leave again. The preliminary assessment took 3 days. Eleanor worked methodically, beginning with the grounds and moving inward to the building itself. The structural condition of the garden walls, the state of the original planting infrastructure, the viability of the path systems, the condition of any decorative elements that had survived the period of neglect. She made detailed notes. She produced sketches. She took measurements. The estate staff observed her work with the particular quality of attention that meant they had opinions and were deciding whether to share them. On the second day, a young undergardener named Thomas, perhaps 17, with the burned forearm tan of someone who had spent his whole life outdoors, appeared beside her while she was measuring the east parterre and said without preamble, "The master won't like it if you take out the yew hedging." Eleanor looked at the yew hedging in question. It was overgrown and had almost entirely obscured the formal garden's original geometry. But the underlying plants were structurally sound and had been there for at least a century. She had already concluded that restoration rather than removal was the correct approach. "I wasn't planning to," she said. Thomas considered this. "Mr. Graves, the man before you, the landscaping company from London, he wanted to take it all out and start fresh. The master sent him away on the 3rd day. What was wrong with starting fresh?" Thomas looked at the hedging with the expression of someone whose relationship to a place went considerably deeper than his years of official employment might suggest. "Nothing wrong with it exactly, just that it wouldn't have been the same garden anymore, would it? It'd have been a new garden in the same place. The master doesn't want a new garden." He paused. "He just wants the real one back." Eleanor looked at the overgrown parterre, at the original geometry still present beneath the encroachment, the old design waiting under the disorder of years of neglect, and thought about a man who had sent away a landscaping company from London for proposing to replace rather than restore. "When did the garden last have a proper head gardener?" she asked. 6 years ago, Thomas said. When Mrs. Whitcombe the elder passed. The old gardener retired at the same time. Couldn't face it without her, he said. He glanced toward the house. The master kept the kitchen garden staffed and everything that needed managing. But the formal grounds, he said, they could wait. Wait for what? Thomas looked at her with the directness of someone who was 17 and had not yet learned to be strategic about what he said. Don't know. I always thought he was waiting to want it again. Eleanor filed this information with the information about the Western Garden. She gave her preliminary report on Friday morning. Nathaniel Whitcombe received it in the library, seated behind a desk that was occupied by the organized evidence of a man who ran a large and complex operation and required every element of it to be immediately accessible and correctly ordered. He read the report with the attention he apparently brought to everything, turning pages without comment, occasionally returning to a previous section to compare something. Eleanor stood on the other side of the desk and did not fill the silence with explanation, because she had written the report carefully and it said what it needed to say. When he finished, he set it down with the small, deliberate precision she was beginning to recognize as characteristic, the movement of someone who did not put things down without considering where they were being put. You recommend preserving the yew hedging, he said. It's structurally sound, and the original geometry is intact beneath the overgrowth. Removal would cost more time and material than restoration, and the result would lack the maturity that gives the garden its character. She paused. I understand the previous contractor recommended removal. He recommended starting fresh, Nathaniel said, as though what existed was not worth preserving. He said it without particular heat, as a simple statement of what had been wrong with the recommendation. Sometimes starting fresh is the correct approach, Eleanor said, when the damage is structural and irreversible. In this case, it isn't. He looked at her. You've done this before, he said. Not restoration specifically. The ability to assess something damaged and determine what's worth saving. I've been doing it since I was 12 years old, she said. My father was an archivist. He collected damaged things, estate records, old correspondence, historical documents in various states of deterioration. He believed that the information they contained was worth the effort of the retrieval, regardless of the condition of the container. She paused. I learned to look at the condition without letting it determine my judgment about the value. Nathaniel looked into the report, then at her, then at the window beyond which she knew the east parterre waited in its 3 centuries of accumulated form. The western garden, he said. It's not in your assessment. I noticed it wasn't included in the brief, she said carefully. I observed it independently and formed some initial conclusions, but I didn't want to include it without your indication that it was within the scope of the commission. He was quiet for a moment. It isn't, he said. Within the scope. All right. The rest of the grounds are. Yes. Another pause. He turned the corner of the report over slightly, a small unconscious movement that she was beginning to learn was what his hands did when he was thinking about something he had not yet decided. My mother designed that garden, he said. His voice did not change in any significant external way, but something in the quality of the air around the words was different. She spent 15 years on it. The design is hers, the planting plan, the structure, the choice of everything in it. He looked at the window. When she died, I was advised to have it cleared and replanted. Several people suggested it would be a good opportunity to update the grounds. Eleanor said nothing. I declined, he said. It has been maintained at a basic level, kept from further deterioration, but it has not been. He stopped, considered. I have not known how to approach it correctly. The library was very quiet around them. The Friday morning light came through the tall windows at the angle of late autumn sun, clear, but without warmth, the quality of light that illuminates without softening. When you decide how to approach it, Eleanor said after a moment, I would be glad to help if you want it, not redesign it, not start fresh. She held his gaze. Only restore what's there. He looked at her for a long moment. With the full, careful attention she had first encountered in the entrance hall, the attention of someone who was genuinely trying to determine what they were seeing. Then he looked back at the report. The preliminary assessment is approved, he said. You may proceed. She gathered her notes and turned to leave. Miss Whitfield. She turned back. He was looking at the report, still not at her. The yew hedging in the east parterre. The original planting was threaded with box hedging at the lower level. A secondary geometric pattern intended to be visible only from the upper windows of the house. It's likely been completely obscured. He paused. Worth looking for. She had not noticed this from the ground. She had not yet had occasion to view the parterre from the upper windows. She filed it as information from someone who had been looking at that garden for 36 years and knew it in a way she did not yet. Thank you, she said. He nodded. She left, and she stood for a moment in the corridor outside the library with the distinct impression that she had just had a conversation that was also something else. Something she did not yet have the right word for, the beginning of something. Perhaps that neither of them had entirely intended. That afternoon, she found the blueprint. She had been cataloging the contents of a storage room connected to the estate's main archive. A room that Mrs. Aldrin had identified as containing documents and materials relevant to the estate's historical management, which Eleanor needed to review for the restoration to be accurate to the original designs. Most of what she found was what she expected. Old planting records, supplier invoices, estate correspondence. She was working through the rolled paper tubes, the kind used for architectural drawings and garden plans, when she found the one that was different. It was larger than the others, older from the quality of the paper. She unrolled it carefully on the archive table, anchoring the corners with the small weights she carried in her case for exactly this kind of work. It was a garden plan. Detailed, precise, drawn with the kind of loving attention that went beyond professional draftsmanship into something more personal. She recognized the layout immediately. The western garden seen from above, every planting position indicated, every path labeled the spatial relationships between elements, planned with an intelligence that she, as a designer herself, recognized and respected. In the corner, in a hand that was different from the technical notations, warmer, more personal, a small inscription, for Nathaniel, when he finally allows himself to live. Eleanor stood in the archive room in the thin afternoon light, and looked at those words for a long time. She thought about a garden carefully maintained, but not approached. She thought about a man who had declined to have it cleared and declined to have it redesigned, and had instead, she understood now, been keeping it. Exactly as it was. Exactly as she left it. Waiting. She thought about what Thomas had said. I always thought he was waiting to want it again. She thought about a woman who had designed something beautiful and left it for her son with an inscription that was not about the garden at all. That was about the man she knew he could be if he would only let himself. She thought about damaged things and the structures beneath them, and the patience required to sit with something long enough to understand what it had been before it became what it was now. She rolled the blueprint carefully and tied it with a length of archival ribbon and set it on the corner of the table where she would see it in the morning. She was going to need to think about what to do with this, about what it meant that the blueprint existed, about what it meant that Nathaniel Whitcombe had kept it here, not displayed, not destroyed, not given away, but kept in the quiet of an archive room, waiting for the right moment or the right person to find it. She did not know yet if she was the right person. She knew that she had found it, and she knew with the same instinct she brought to every damaged document, every neglected garden, every beautiful thing that had been set aside and not yet abandoned, that what she was holding was not simply a design for a garden. It was a message from a mother to a son who was still, after all this time, in the process of learning to receive it. She turned off the archive lamp. She walked back to her room through the quiet corridors of Whitcombe Estate, through the rooms that were preserved but not lived in, past the covered furniture and the closed doors and the careful, maintained silence of a house that had been keeping itself ready for something it had not yet allowed itself to name. And she thought, he is not a man who does not feel. He is a man who has not yet found the way back to it. She looked out her window at the dark shape of the western garden at the edge of the grounds tended in private, approached alone, loved quietly, and without witness for years. Someone planted roses there, she thought, in winter without knowing if they would take. She fell asleep thinking about a blueprint signed with love, and a man who had been waiting without realizing it for someone patient enough to read it. The box hedging was there. Eleanor found it on the Monday of her second week, viewed from the third-floor window of the east wing that looked directly down onto the parterre. She had gone up early before the light shifted, carrying her sketchbook, and the deliberate intention of seeing what she had been told was worth looking for. And there it was, beneath the overgrowth of years, the secondary geometric pattern still present in the underlying structure of the garden, a smaller, more intimate design nested inside the grander one visible only from above. She made a careful sketch of what she could see, marking the positions of the surviving box plants, noting where the pattern had been interrupted and where it remained intact. Then she stood at the window for a moment longer than the sketch required and looked at the garden from the angle that Nathaniel Whitcombe had been seeing it from for 36 years. It was beautiful. Even in its present condition, even under the disorder of neglect, it was the kind of design that rewarded the patient eye, that gave more the longer you looked at it. The kind of garden that had been made by someone who understood that the best designs were not the ones that announced themselves immediately, but the ones that revealed themselves slowly to the people who stayed long enough to see. She went back downstairs and began to work. The first 2 weeks of active restoration established a rhythm. Eleanor was in the east garden by 7 each morning, working with Thomas and a second undergardener named William, who had the quiet competence of someone who had grown up on the estate and understood its specific requirements in a way that no outside expertise could entirely replicate. She directed and they implemented, and between the three of them, they established a pace that was faster than Eleanor had initially estimated, because the bones of the garden were sounder than they had appeared from the ground, and the plants themselves, the yew, the box, the old rose standards that had been left to grow wild along the south wall, had more vitality in them than their overgrown condition suggested. Life under neglect was not the same as life extinguished. She had known this. She had known it professionally for years. But there was something different about knowing it in theory and watching it happen in practice. Watching a garden that had looked from the carriage window on her arrival like a problem reveal itself week by week as something that had simply been waiting. Nathaniel Whitcombe did not come to the east garden in the first week. She was aware of his movements in the peripheral way. She became aware of anything significant in a space she was working. in the distant sound of his study window, opening in the mornings, the particular gravel sound of his footfall on the path that ran along the south wing of the house, the times when Mrs. Aldrin's manner shifted slightly in the way that indicated the master was in a specific part of the building and the household was adjusting accordingly. He was present on the estate. How was not in her garden. She did not consider it her garden. She noted that she had used the phrasing internally and corrected it. On the 9th day he came. She did not hear him approach. She was on her knees at the edge of the parterre, carefully working back the overgrowth from a section of box hedging with the fine clippers she used for close work, and she became aware of him because the quality of the morning air changed in the specific way it changed when someone was standing near enough to be present without being close enough to be intrusive. She finished the section she was working on before she looked up. I was standing perhaps 10 feet away, looking at the parterre from a slightly elevated position on the path, looking at it the way she had learned. He looked at things that mattered to him, which was with complete attention and no visible expression of what the attention was producing internally. The secondary pattern is beginning to be visible, she said. Not explaining, not performing, simply observing what was there. He looked at the emerging lower geometry, the box hedging, coming back into definition as the work progressed. He said nothing for a moment. She planted it that way deliberately, he said. She said a garden that was only beautiful from inside itself was a garden without imagination. Beauty should reward different perspectives. Eleanor sat back on her heels and looked at the pattern she had been uncovering. She was right. He looked at the work she had done on the south section, the careful clearing, the preserved plants, the cleaned stone edging that had been invisible under 2 years of encroachment. He looked at it the way she had looked at the blueprint in the archive room, with the recognition of someone encountering a thing they had known in a different form and finding the original. It looks like itself again, he said quietly. I was not talking to her exactly. The observation was directed at the garden. She understood this and did not make it a conversation he had not intended. He stayed for perhaps 15 minutes. He did not offer opinions or direction. He stood at the edge of the path and watched her work and watched Thomas and William work, and once he walked the length of the south wall to look at the old rose standards, and once he crouched briefly to examine the root base of a particularly large yew that they had been debating whether to retain or remove. "Retain it," he said when he stood. "That was my conclusion," Eleanor said. He nodded. He walked back toward the house. At the corner of the path he stopped without turning. The southeast corner. There's a section of original brick edging under the moss on the far side. It was part of the first planting plan earlier than the rest. It may be worth preserving separately if it's still intact. He left before she could respond. She went to the southeast corner and spent the next hour uncovering it. The brick edging was intact, 2 centuries old, laid in a pattern she had not seen in any of the estate plans she had reviewed, which meant it predated the formal archive. She photographed it and added it to her restoration notes, and felt with the specific satisfaction of work that keeps revealing more than it appeared to contain that she had not yet seen everything this garden had to show her. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. He never announced himself. He never asked questions about the process or offered suggestions beyond the occasional specific detail. The location of a buried path marker she would not have found for weeks, the original height of a topiary form that had been allowed to grow shapeless. These were details that could only come from someone who had grown up in this garden and carried it in a specific embodied memory that no amount of archival research could replicate. She received them the way she received all useful information, noted, integrated, applied. She did not comment on the pattern of his arrivals. She did not make his presence a subject of conversation or adjust her manner to accommodate it. She worked. He stood at the edges of the space, and then gradually over the course of that second week, he moved closer to the center of it. Until one morning, she looked up from the parterre and found him not on the path, but in the garden itself, crouched beside the southeast brick edging she had uncovered, running his fingers along the old pattern with the specific attention of someone remembering something through their hands. She went back to her work. After a while, he said without looking up, "My grandfather laid this, before the formal gardens were designed. It was the original kitchen garden boundary. They built the parterre over it and incorporated the edge rather than removing it. He paused. I used to sit here when I was young. My mother would work in the south beds, and I would sit on this edging and talk to her. Eleanor looked at this brick edging 2 centuries old, laid by a man who had not yet become history, incorporated into a garden designed by a woman who had known it was there and chosen to honor it by keeping it. What did you talk about? She asked. Normal voice, genuine question. He considered it. Everything. Nothing. The way conversations are when you are 7 years old and the person you are talking to is someone whose attention you trust completely. He looked at the pattern beneath his fingers. She had a way of listening that made you believe whatever you were saying was worth saying. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. My father was the same, she said. He would sit in his archive for hours working through documents, and you could tell him anything while he worked, and he would listen with his whole attention without ever stopping what he was doing. It was the only place I ever felt that the words coming out of my mouth were exactly the right words. He looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her directly during one of these mornings in the garden. Not the glancing attention of someone noting a presence, but the full attention she had come to understand was his way of indicating that something mattered. He's gone, he said, 3 years ago. I'm sorry. Thank you. She turned back to the work in front of her. The archive is still there. I still sit in it sometimes. I think certain rooms hold the people who used to be in them if you are quiet enough to let them. He was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. I believe that. She began to notice other things. On a Wednesday afternoon, she saw him speak with Edith, the youngest of the kitchen maids, a conversation that began because Edith had dropped a tray of glass near the kitchen entrance, and the sound had brought Nathaniel out of the study he faced onto the rear yard. Eleanor had been returning from the garden and had stopped at the corner unobserved while the exchange resolved itself. He had not reprimanded. He had helped briefly with collecting the larger pieces. A gesture so practical and so entirely lacking in the self-consciousness of a man, demonstrating his own virtue, that she had registered it as something other than performance. And then he had asked Edith something that made the girl answer with relief visible in her shoulders, and whatever the answer was, he had nodded and gone back to the study. Later she asked Thomas with studied casualness what he knew about Edith. Thomas glanced at the kitchen windows. Her mother's been ill. Local physician is expensive. The master arranged for the estate physician to see her last month, doesn't charge for families connected to the house. He said it as though it were simply a fact of the estate's operation. She thought how many similar facts would she find if she were looking. She began looking. The evidence accumulated quietly over the following days, not announced, not recorded in any ledger she had access to, but present in the specific texture of the estate's human life. The family in the North Cottage whose rent had been suspended while the father recovered from an injury. The retired groundskeeper, too old to work, still living in the estate cottage that by rights he should have vacated. Thomas's mother, she discovered in passing, had received assistance from the estate accounts during a difficult winter 2 years ago. None of these things were discussed. They were simply part of the ordinary operations of a man who managed a great deal and believed apparently that certain forms of responsibility did not require acknowledgement. She thought about what the county said of him. Reserved. Cold. Interested only in the maintenance of the Whitcombe name and the accumulation of business advantage. The man who kept his household at perfect order and his social obligations at perfect arm's length and his feelings at a distance so consistent it might as well have been policy. She thought about a kitchen maid whose mother was ill and a physician who did not charge for estate families. She thought about the difference between what a thing appeared to be and what it was. In the 3rd week, she found him in the archive. She had gone in the late afternoon to retrieve a set of historical documents she needed to cross-reference against the garden plans, and she had stopped in the doorway because he was already there. Seated at the table she used for her research work, with a set of old correspondence spread before him, reading with the concentrated stillness of someone who had been in this room for some time. He looked up when she appeared. I apologize, she said. I can come back. No. He moved some of the papers slightly to make room on the table, a small automatic gesture of accommodation. I was reviewing estate correspondence from my grandfather's period. There is a reference to the original kitchen-garden boundary that seemed relevant after, he paused, after last week. She came into the room. She retrieved the documents she needed from the archive shelves and brought them to the far end of the table and began her work. They sat in the archive together in the particular quiet of two people comfortable with silence, each attending to their own work, each aware of the other without making it a subject. After perhaps 20 minutes, he said without looking up from his correspondence, "You were trained as a historian." "As a designer," she said. "The historical training is self-taught. I found early on that the work was better when I understood the context of what I was restoring. A garden designed in 1780 has different intentions than one designed in 1820. Understanding the period helps me understand what was meant. Most people in your profession don't approach it that way. Most people in my profession are not hired by estates that contain 3 centuries of continuous design history." She looked up. "This is an unusual commission. The east parterre is early Georgian in its primary structure, but the secondary box pattern reads as transitional later. Georgian influence probably added in the 1790s, when the fashion for less rigid formality was beginning. Your mother's additions are clearly Victorian in their sensibility. But she was working in deliberate conversation with the earlier forms, not against them." She paused. She understood the history of what she was working within. That's rare. He had set down his correspondence and was looking at her with the full attention. "She studied garden history," he said. "Informally, the way women of her generation were required to do most things informally. She had a collection books portfolios correspondence with other garden designers. She traded ideas and letters with women she never met in person, because the professional societies wouldn't admit them." "Where is the collection?" "The upper study. I have not—" He stopped. "I've left it as it was." Eleanor held his gaze for a moment. "If it would help the restoration to have access to the reference materials she was working from, I would treat them carefully." "I know you would," he said. It was said without deliberation, as though the conclusion was so self-evident it did not require examination. She went back to her documents. He went back to his correspondence. Outside the archive window. The evening was coming in over the Whitcombe grounds, and the sky was the particular shade of early winter gold that lasts about 20 minutes and makes everything it touches look like something worth preserving. The evening walks began without either of them deciding on them. It had started, she thought afterward, on a Tuesday evening when she had been returning from a late survey of the west parterre wall and had found him at the edge of the south grounds, looking at the tree line with the expression she associated with solitude rather than sociability. She had said good evening and kept walking. He had, after a pause, turned and walked in the same direction, and somewhere between the south grounds and the house they had been walking together, and somewhere in that walk they had been talking, and she had not been certain when the transition happened from one thing to the next. They talked about the estate, then about restoration more broadly, then with the gradual loosening that happens between people who have spent enough time in each other's practical company that the social formalities have begun to seem like unnecessary weight. They talked about other things. She learned that he had studied in Boston before returning to take over the estate, that he had intended before his father's death to establish himself independently, not in direct management of the Whitcombe properties, but in something adjacent, something that would have been his own rather than inherited. She could tell from the specific way he did not elaborate on this that it was a subject with an edge to it, the edge of a decision made under circumstances rather than by choice. What would it have been, she asked one evening when the frost had come early and their breath was visible in the cold air. The independent work. How was quiet for a moment. "Architecture," he said. "I was interested in the restoration of old buildings. There was a professor in Boston, a man who had spent his career on colonial-era structures, the preservation of things that were genuinely at risk of being lost. I had arranged a position with his practice." He paused. "My father died in my second year. The position ended before it began." She thought about this. "You restore things," she said, "in the way you manage this estate. The decisions about what to keep, what to maintain, as it is, rather than replace, that's the same instinct." He glanced at her. "It's not the same." "No," she agreed. but it came from the same place. He looked at the tree line. I used to believe that the things we give up leave a kind of gap, that you feel them as absences. He paused. I've come to think it's not that simple. The things we give up sometimes move. They find another form. The architecture in the estate management, she said. Perhaps. She thought about her own discarded plans, the formal academic program. She had not been able to afford the institutional position she had applied for twice and been passed over for twice. The particular dreams of a younger self that had required in practice a pragmatic restructuring. She thought about how she had been telling herself for the past several years that the practical work was enough, that the doing of it was its own satisfaction. She had believed it mostly. She was not entirely certain she believed it still. What about you? He said. She looked at him. What did you give up? He asked. Not as an intrusion. As a question asked by someone who had offered an equivalent answer and was extending the same expectation of honesty. She considered it carefully. The belief that expertise would be sufficient, she said. That if I was good enough at the work, the question of who I was and where I came from would become irrelevant. She paused. I was 23 when I understood that was not how it worked. That excellence was necessary, but not determinative. That there would always be rooms I could enter because of what I could do, and rooms I would never enter regardless. This room, he said, quietly. The question had a specific weight. This commission, she said, was the first time someone of your position engaged me for the work itself, rather than as a lower-cost alternative to a more expensive option. She paused. I am still not entirely certain whether that is what this is, or whether Mr. Holt simply didn't tell you enough about me before I arrived. The almost smile. He told me you were the most precise restoration professional he had encountered in 20 years of estate management. He said the work you had done on the Ashworth Commission was the reason the East Wing survived the sale to the Historical Preservation Society. A pause. He did not mention your age. Would it have changed your decision? He looked at her directly. No, he said. But it would have changed my assumption about what I was expecting when you arrived. She nodded. And what are you expecting now? He looked ahead at the path. I have stopped expecting, he said. I find that more useful. She found the upper study unlocked on a Thursday morning. She had not tried it before. It had not been offered, and she had not asked, and the closed doors of Whitcombe Estate had taught her to treat her own curiosity with patience, to wait for the opening rather than manufacture one. But on Thursday morning, she passed the upper study on her way to the archive, and the door was not closed. It was open perhaps a foot, and through the gap she could see the slant of morning light on a reading desk and the shapes of shelves filled with the particular vertical arrangement of books, organized by someone who loved them. She did not enter. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to the archive and began her day's work. 2 hours later, Nathaniel Whitcombe appeared in the archive doorway. He was carrying a portfolio, old leather-bound, the kind used for loose drawings and papers. Her reference collection, he said. He set it on the table. I thought it might be useful. Eleanor looked at the portfolio, then at him. He turned to leave. Nathaniel, she said. It was the first time she had used his given name. It had come out without premeditation, the way things come out when you have been thinking of someone a certain way for long enough that the thinking overtakes the formality. He stopped. He turned. His expression was not surprised exactly. Something more careful than surprise. Thank you, she said. He nodded, and left. She opened the portfolio with the care she brought to everything worth caring about. It was Mrs. Aldrin who told her on a Friday evening, when the household was settling toward the quieter end of the week, that guests were expected on Sunday. Family, Mrs. Aldrin said with a specific compression of the word that communicated additional information without elaborating on it. Mr. and Mrs. Charles Whitcombe, His Grace's cousins. She was arranging the good linen in the dining room, and she said it without looking up, which Eleanor had learned was Mrs. Aldrin's method of conveying things she considered professionally important without requiring a response. Shall I adjust my working hours? Eleanor asked. If the house is to be occupied for guests, your hours are your own, Mrs. Aldrin said. You are here on commission. That does not change for family visits. A pause. Though I would recommend completing any work in the main house corridors before Sunday morning. Eleanor nodded and went back to the east wing. The Whitcombe cousins arrived on Sunday afternoon in a carriage that managed to be tasteful and expensive in equal measure. Eleanor observed their arrival from the east garden where she was working and registered a man of perhaps 45, with the comfortable authority of someone who had never seriously questioned his place in the world, and a woman of similar age with the particular kind of social intelligence that spends itself primarily on assessment. She watched them go inside. She went back to the box hedging. She met them at dinner that evening. A formal dinner in the main dining room, the first she had been included in, which told her that Nathaniel had made a decision about the nature of her position at the estate that went slightly beyond the strictly professional. She dressed carefully. She sat where Mrs. Aldrin had placed her setting at the lower end of the table, but within the circle of the conversation, and she listened more than she spoke, which was her customary approach in social situations where she was still establishing the landscape. Charles Whitcombe was pleasant in a surface way that did not require engagement. He spoke primarily about business estate management investment decisions, the general operations of wealthy families navigating economic change. He asked Eleanor one question about the restoration work, received a brief professional answer, and moved on. His wife, Mrs. Cecilia Whitcombe, did not ask Eleanor any questions at all. She observed her in the careful way of a woman whose primary intelligence is social, and she spoke to Nathaniel with the ease of long familiarity and the specific warmth of someone who believed she understood him well. After dinner, the men went to the study, and Eleanor and Cecilia sat in the drawing room with tea and the specific social friction of two women with nothing obvious in common, and the forms of politeness requiring them to generate conversation from that nothing. Cecilia poured the tea with the ease of someone who had always poured tea in other people's houses. "You are the restoration professional," she said, not unkindly, with the specific inflection of someone naming a category. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Nathaniel said the gardens are coming along well. The east parterre is progressing. The full restoration will take the remaining 8 weeks." "He spoke of it at some length, actually," Cecilia said with a small smile that was doing several things at once. "He's not a man who speaks at length about much. The gardens seem to have caught his attention." She looked at Eleanor over her teacup. "As has the restoration professional, if I'm honest." Eleanor met her gaze evenly. "We have had useful conversations about the historical context of the estate's design. He has a great deal of specific knowledge about the original plantings that has helped the restoration considerably. He does love this estate," Cecilia said with the same layered smile. "He always has. It's the one thing he's never been indifferent to." A pause. "The other areas of his life have been more managed, responsibly, but without particular feeling." She set down her teacup. "Which is why Charles and I are here, actually. Not entirely for the pleasure of the visit." Eleanor waited. "There is a family that has been connected to the Whitcombes through business for 2 generations, Cecilia said. "The Hartfords. Their daughter, a very accomplished young woman, excellent family appropriate in every regard, has been suggested as a potential match for Nathaniel. Charles believes the timing is right. A formal proposal of engagement would strengthen several significant business arrangements simultaneously." She said it in the tone of someone delivering practical information. "We came to discuss it with him this weekend." Eleanor said nothing. "He has not been opposed to the idea in principle," Cecilia continued. "He understands the value of a well-considered match. He is a man of 36 with an estate to think about and a name to continue. These are real considerations." "Yes," Eleanor said. "They are. I simply wanted to be sure." Cecilia paused with the delicacy of someone choosing words carefully. "These things are easier when everyone understands their position. Don't you find?" Eleanor held the woman's gaze for a moment. She thought about the blueprint in the archive, the evening walks, the portfolio of a mother's reference collection carried into the archive and left without ceremony. The way he had stopped in the corridor when she said his name, and turned back with an expression that was careful in the specific way of things that are being kept careful by effort. "I understand my position very well," Eleanor said. "I have always found that clarity makes the work cleaner." Cecilia smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had accomplished what she came to accomplish. They finished their tea. Eleanor was in the East Garden the following afternoon when she heard them. She had not intended to. She had come around the south wall of the house on her way from the storeroom, taking the shortcut she had discovered in her first week, and the drawing-room windows were open because the weather had turned briefly warmer. The voices came through clearly, without any effort on her part to hear them. "She is competent," Charles Whitcomb's voice. "I'll grant you that. The garden looks better than it has in years." "She is temporary," Cecilia's voice. "You need to remember that, Nathaniel. She will finish the commission and leave. That is the arrangement." Nathaniel said something she could not fully hear. "Don't mistake gratitude for something else." Cecilia's voice was firm, with the firmness of someone delivering a verdict they believe to be kind. "A gentleman like you cannot confuse what you feel when someone brings life back into this house with what you actually need. The Hartford match is real. It is lasting. It will serve the estate and the family for generations." A pause. "Whatever the restoration professional makes you feel when she looks at the East Garden that is temporary, the name is not." Eleanor stopped walking. She stood at the corner of the south wall with the sun on her back and the voices coming through the open window, and something happening inside her chest that she was not prepared for, because she had told herself, she had been telling herself clearly, rationally, with the discipline of a woman who had spent her professional life keeping the boundaries of her work distinct, that the conversations were professional, and the walks were professional, and the portfolio left on the archive table was professional, and the warmth she felt in the archive in the evenings when the light changed was simply the warmth of work that was going well. She had been telling herself this. She had not apparently been listening. She made herself move. She walked away from the south wall back toward the East Garden with the deliberate steadiness of someone who has been caught without adequate preparation and is now deciding step by step how to return to the correct position. She thought they are not wrong. She thought I came here to restore a garden. She thought I should not have used his name. She went back to the box hedging, and she worked until the light was gone, and she did not let herself think with any precision about what she had just understood about herself, about what had grown quietly and without announcement in the same weeks that the garden was growing. She only allowed herself one clear thought as she covered her tools at the end of the day. They are right that I am temporary. The question is whether temporary is the same as mistaken. She did not have an answer. She went inside. She did not go to dinner. And in her room that evening, she sat at the window, looking at the dark shapes of the grounds she had been making beautiful for someone else, and thought about a woman's voice saying a gentleman like Nathaniel cannot confuse gratitude with love. She thought no. She thought, but I wonder if I have. Continue writing. Part 3, based on the approved outline. Requirements. Continue naturally from Part 2. Build toward the biggest emotional turning point. Reveal important truths gradually. Increase suspense, emotional stakes, and character transformation. The climax must come from character choices, not random events. Keep the story realistic and emotionally powerful. Do not summarize. Length 4,000 to 4,500 words. Outline. Part 3. The choice between duty and love. Part goal. Create the emotional turning point where both characters realize their feelings but cannot openly choose them. Main events. Nathaniel struggles between family expectations and his growing feelings. Eleanor considers leaving after the restoration is complete. Nathaniel begins protecting Eleanor's reputation when society criticizes her presence at the estate. He publicly supports her work despite criticism. Eleanor learns. Nathaniel secretly saved her family's failing business years earlier without revealing his involvement. She realizes his kindness has always existed beneath his controlled exterior. Emotional change. Nathaniel. He realizes. Protecting my reputation means losing the one person who truly knows me. Eleanor. She realizes I do not love his wealth or position. I love the man he hides from everyone. Relationship development. Their bond becomes deeper. Honest conversations. Emotional vulnerability. Mutual admiration. Romantic milestone. Nathaniel admits that Eleanor is the first person who makes the estate feel alive again. But he stops himself from saying more. Conflict escalation. Nathaniel's family forces the issue. The engagement announcement will happen at the upcoming estate celebration. Eleanor believes Nathaniel will choose duty. Nathaniel believes choosing Eleanor would destroy her future. Both misunderstand each other's feelings. Ending hook. Before leaving the estate temporarily, Eleanor finds a letter written by Nathaniel's mother. The letter reveals Nathaniel was never meant to inherit only a fortune. He was meant to build a life filled with love. Show more Part 3. The choice between duty and love. She did not change anything visible. This was the discipline she had learned earliest and practiced longest. The ability to continue doing what was required of her, without allowing what was happening internally to alter the surface of it. She had learned it at 20, the first time she had walked into a professional assessment and understood within 3 minutes that the men across the table had already decided what her work was worth before she had opened her portfolio. She had learned it at 24, when the Ashworth Commission had nearly been given to someone else, because the estate manager had assumed without asking that a woman working independently could not manage a project of that scale. She had learned it in a dozen rooms before this one. She brought it now to the east garden of Whitcombe Estate, in the days after the drawing room window, and she worked with the same precision she had always brought to the work, and she was pleasant and professional with Thomas and William, and she delivered her weekly progress report to Mr. Holt on Friday with the same clean documentation as every previous week. What she did not do was go walking in the evenings. The first evening she remained in her room. She told herself it was because she had paperwork to complete. The second evening she told herself the cold had returned. By the third evening she had stopped constructing explanations because the truth was simple, and she was accustomed to looking at simple truths directly. She needed the distance, and the distance required not being in the places where the distance collapsed. She was not certain Nathaniel noticed. Then, on Thursday of that week, she found a book on the archive table. She had come in at her usual time, and it was simply there, placed with the deliberate precision that characterized everything he did, centered on the table where she worked with a strip of paper marking a page near the middle. No note, no explanation. The book was a Victorian horticultural text she had mentioned in passing 2 weeks before, as something she had never been able to locate a copy of. She stood looking at it for a moment. She sat down. She opened it. The marked page contained a detailed plan of a parterre design from 1847, a design that bore a remarkable structural resemblance to the secondary box pattern she was restoring in the East Garden. She looked at it for a long time. Understanding what it meant that he had listened to a passing comment from 3 weeks ago, had located the book, had found the page, and had left it for her without requiring acknowledgement of any of these things. She thought about Cecilia Whitcomb's voice through the open window. She thought, this is the problem. Not that he had done something dramatic. Not that there had been a declaration or a gesture designed to claim her attention. The problem was precisely this: the small, careful, consistent way he did things that were worth doing without requiring anyone to notice. The way kindness operated in him as a form of precision rather than performance. It was very difficult to maintain the correct distance from a man who did not know he was closing it. The Whitcombe cousins left on a Tuesday. Eleanor was in the East Garden when the carriage departed, and she did not observe it directly, but she heard it, the particular gravel sound of departure, and she felt the specific shift in the estate's atmosphere that followed. Whitcombe Estate, she had learned, breathed differently when it was only itself, when the social performance was not required of it. She expected in the days following the departure that Nathaniel would mention the Hartford match, that the conversation with his cousins would produce some visible effect, a formal announcement, a change in the estate's schedule, some indication that a decision had been made or was being made. She prepared herself for this with the same deliberate calm she brought to all anticipated difficulties, and she told herself that when it came, she would receive it correctly, professionally. as information about the circumstances of her commission, and nothing more. It did not come. What came instead on the Wednesday of that week was a letter delivered to the estate by a private courier from the county town, addressed not to Nathaniel, but to Eleanor directly. The handwriting on the envelope was that of her cousin Margaret, her father's niece, who had for the past several years been managing the small archival and bookbinding business that Eleanor had helped establish from the remnants of her father's practice. She read it in her room. The business was in difficulty. Not catastrophically, Margaret was careful with numbers and had maintained the accounts with the same precision Eleanor had established, but a lease renewal had come due at terms that had changed significantly since the original arrangement, and the gap between the current revenue and the new requirements was not bridgeable without outside assistance. Margaret wrote practically without drama, laying out the numbers and the options and the timeline available. Eleanor sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. The business was the last direct continuation of her father's work. It employed 3 women, including Margaret, doing the kind of careful, skilled work that Eleanor had built her own practice from. She had not been drawing income from it for the past 2 years. That had been her contribution to its survival, allowing the revenue to accumulate into operating capital. If the lease could not be renewed, the business would have to close, and the 3 women who depended on it would be without work. And her father's archive, the collection he had spent his life building, the reference library that was the heart of the whole operation, would need to be dissolved. She thought about what she could contribute directly. She did her calculations carefully, the way her father had taught her, without wishful rounding. The commission from Whitcombe would cover the immediate gap, but only barely, and only if she accepted nothing from it for herself. Which meant the following months, the months after Whitcombe, would require her to find another significant commission immediately. Without the period of preparation she usually allowed herself between major projects. She folded the letter. She put it away. She went back to the east garden, and she worked until the light was gone. She was not aware that anything of this was visible until Mrs. Aldrin appeared in the archive doorway on Friday morning with an expression that was not her professional expression. "Are you well, Miss Whitfield?" she said. "Perfectly," Eleanor said. Mrs. Aldrin looked at her with the specific assessment of a woman who has managed a large household for many years and has developed an accurate reading of the difference between perfectly, that means perfectly, and perfectly, that means something else entirely. She said nothing further. She left a cup of tea on the corner of the table and departed. Eleanor worked through the morning. At midday, she set down her tools and looked at what she had completed in the past 3 weeks. The east parterre was almost finished. Another 10 days would see it restored to something that matched the original design with a fidelity she was genuinely proud of. The progress was real and visible, and the garden was becoming daily more fully itself. She thought about Margaret's letter. She thought about the remaining 8 weeks of the commission, which had now contracted in her mind from a period of work to a period of time before she needed to be somewhere else, managing something else, which was a different quality of thought entirely. She was so thoroughly inside this set of calculations that she did not hear Nathaniel come into the archive until he sat down across from her. She looked up. He was looking at her with the full attention, the kind that did not arrive gradually, but was simply present completely when he chose to direct it. "Something is wrong," he said. It was not a question. It was an observation of the same quality he brought to the garden, the ability to see the state of a thing beneath the surface presentation. "A business matter," she said. "It doesn't affect the commission." "I'm not asking about the commission." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the correct boundary. She thought about maintaining it. She thought about the book on the archive table, and the brick edging, and the evening walks, and all the accumulated weight of weeks of someone paying careful, genuine attention to her without requiring anything in return. She told him. Not all of it. The relevant facts, the business, the lease, the numbers, the timeline. She said it in the same voice she used for assessment reports, clean, direct, without the overlay of feeling that would have made it a different kind of conversation than the one she was able to have. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "What is the name of the business?" "Whitfield Archive and Bindery. It's on Clement Street in—" She stopped. Something in his expression had moved, very slightly. the tectonic shift she had learned to recognize. "Why?" He looked at the table. "Nathaniel," she said. He met her eyes with the specific look of someone who has been found out and has decided not to compound the situation with deflection. "I knew your father," he said. "Not well. I encountered him twice in the context of estate research. He found a document for us some years ago, an original deed that had been misplaced and that had significant legal relevance to a boundary dispute." He paused. "He was a remarkable man." "Yes," she said quietly. "After he died, I was told the archive was at risk, that the practice might not survive the transition." He stopped, started differently. "I arranged for a private investment through an intermediary, a business loan at a favorable rate structured so that it would not appear as charity." He paused. "I did not think it required your knowledge." Eleanor was very still. She thought about Margaret's letter, about the business that had survived the transition years when by every reasonable financial calculation it should not have, about the loan they had received from what Margaret had described as a private investor who had asked only for repayment in long installments and had never once inquired about the terms beyond the original agreement. She thought about a man who helped the kitchen maid's mother, the retired groundskeeper in his cottage, the family in the North Lane with the suspended rent. She thought about a pattern of kindness so consistent and so deliberately concealed that it had become invisible, not because he wanted it invisible, but because visibility was not the point. Because the help was the point, and the help worked better when it did not require the recipient to feel that they owed something in return. "You saved the business," she said. "It required saving," he said. "It was a simple decision." It was not a simple decision. It was a private decision about someone you did not know, made without expectation of acknowledgement. He looked at the table. "Your father found an original deed for my family when every professional archivist we engaged told us it had been lost. He charged a third of the market rate because he said the work was its own reward." He paused. "The least I could do was ensure that the work continued." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what she had believed 3 weeks ago, sitting in the drawing room with Cecilia Whitcomb's teacup between them. She thought about the wall she had been building daily, with the discipline of a woman who understood the correct distance between herself and a situation that could not end well. She thought about how much more difficult that wall was going to be to maintain now. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was steady. "That is thank you." He nodded. He looked as though he wanted to say something else and had decided for reasons she could not fully read that it was not the moment. He stood. He moved toward the door. "Nathaniel." She said his name again and again. It came without premeditation, from the place where she had stopped bothering to keep a formal distance. He stopped. "The book," she said. "The horticultural text. Where did you find it?" A pause. "A bookshop in the town. I remembered you had mentioned it." He said it simply. "It seemed useful." She looked at him. "It was," she said. "Very." He left. And Eleanor sat in the archive with her hands folded on the table and allowed herself for the first time to stop pretending that the thing happening inside her when he was in a room was something she could resolve by not going on evening walks. The county gathering was announced at the end of November. It came in the form of a letter to Nathaniel. Eleanor saw the envelope on the hall table on a Thursday morning, recognized the formal letterhead of the County Magistrates Association, and thought nothing particular of it. Such correspondence was part of the ordinary administrative life of an estate of this size. She understood its significance that evening, when Mrs. Aldrin mentioned it while reviewing the household schedule for the following weeks. "His Grace will be hosting a gathering of county families in 3 weeks, Mrs. Aldrin said. December the 14th. Dinner for 30 guests, followed by a viewing of the restored East grounds by lantern light. It will be the estate's first formal gathering in 6 years. She paused. "Your work will be the centerpiece of the evening." Eleanor processed this. "It will need to be finished by the 14th, she said. "Yes, I believe that was the intention from the beginning, the reopening of the estate to county society." Mrs. Aldrin's expression was professionally neutral. "The Hartford family will be among the guests." Eleanor met her gaze. "I see," she said. Mrs. Aldrin nodded once and returned to her schedule. Eleanor went back to her room and sat at the window and looked at the east grounds in the dark and thought 3 weeks. The restoration would be completed. The gathering would occur. The Hartford family would come. And whatever decision was going to be made, whatever had been discussed between Nathaniel and his cousins, whatever the coming weeks would produce in terms of the Hartford match and the future of the Whitcombe name, 3 weeks was the timeline in which it would happen. She had 3 weeks. She was not certain with any honesty what she intended to do with that. What she did not expect was the arrival of Mrs. Aldred Crane. Mrs. Crane was the wife of a county landowner, a woman of considerable social standing, and the specific kind of self-appointed authority that presents itself as community concern. She arrived at Whitcombe Estate on a Monday morning without an appointment, which told Eleanor something about the confidence with which she moved through the world, and she was received by Mrs. Aldrin in the front parlor and offered tea, which told Eleanor something about the careful management required of a housekeeper whose employer valued his privacy above almost everything else. Eleanor was in the east garden when Mrs. Crane departed, which meant she did not witness the visit directly. She heard about it from Thomas, who had overheard from the kitchen garden what passed when Mrs. Crane stepped outside to examine the grounds, which she apparently did without being invited in the manner of someone who does not consider the distinction between invited and uninvited particularly relevant to her movements. What Mrs. Crane had said to the woman who had accompanied her and who Thomas did not recognize was this: "It is rather extraordinary that he has installed a young woman alone in that house. Whatever her professional credentials, it is not how things are done. One wonders what the Hartford family will make of it." Thomas reported it to Eleanor with the directness of someone who believed she should have the information and would know what to do with it. She thanked him. She went back to the box hedging. She worked through the afternoon with the deliberate steadiness of someone managing something that wants to become a different, larger feeling if given enough room. She was still working in the early evening. When she heard footsteps on the path she recognized as Nathaniel's, and she did not look up immediately because she had learned that looking up immediately was a form of acknowledgement that she was counting steps. "I have been told," he said, coming to stand at the edge of the parterre, "that Mrs. Aldred Crane visited this morning." "Yes." "And that she made remarks about your presence here." Eleanor set down her clippers. "Thomas has good hearing. Thomas has the specific gift of being present in important moments." He looked at the garden, not at her. At the garden in the particular way he looked at the parterre when what he was really doing was thinking. "She has already written to 2 families in the county. She intends to raise the question at the Magistrates' Association gathering next week." "What question?" "Whether it is appropriate for an unmarried woman of limited social position to be living in a private estate without proper," she uses the word, "supervision." His voice was entirely level. The levelness of something kept level by conscious management. "She intends to suggest that your presence here reflects poorly on my judgment." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "I can arrange to stay at the inn in the village," she said, "for the remaining weeks. It would be less convenient for the work, but it would remove the basis of the 'you will not.'" He said it without emphasis, but also without any ambiguity whatsoever. "You are here on a professional commission. Your work is exceptional. The quality of what you have done in this garden is worth more than Mrs. Crane's opinion of the arrangement. It doesn't matter what the work is worth if the arrangement damages your reputation before the county gathering." He looked at her then, directly with the full attention. "I am going to address it," he said. "Directly. I intend to speak to the Magistrates' Association myself and present the commission formally. The terms of the engagement, the professional credentials, the historical significance of the restoration. I will make it clear that the arrangement is entirely appropriate, and that any suggestion otherwise reflects an ignorance of the professional practice of estate restoration, rather than any actual concern for the estate's reputation." She looked at him. "That will invite more attention, not less." "Yes," he said. "It will." Mrs. Crane will interpret a direct defense as confirmation that there is something to. Mrs. Crane will interpret whatever arrangement suits her preferred narrative, he said. "That is not something I can control. What I can control is whether the correct version of the situation is on record." He paused. You have done nothing that requires defense. You have done exceptional work. I will not allow a woman's professional reputation to be damaged by someone else's inference while she is working in my employ." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about a girl of 22 walking into an assessment room. She thought about the Ashworth Commission. She thought about every room she had entered on the basis of what she could demonstrate, and every room she had been kept out of on the basis of what she was assumed to be. She thought about a man who had found a botanical text and left it on a table without requiring acknowledgement. She thought, "I love him." The thought arrived with the specific quality of things that have been true for some time and have simply been waiting for the right moment of clarity to declare themselves. It was not a revelation. It was a recognition, the way you recognize a path you have been on for a while when you finally reach a point where you can see the whole of it. She looked at the East Garden, at the work of the past 7 weeks, the emerging geometry, the restored form, the garden becoming itself again, and she felt the recognition land completely. She loved him. She loved the man he kept carefully beneath the public surface. The man who knew every servant's name. The man who planted kindness in quiet corners and never waited for the harvest. The man who had stood at the edge of his mother's garden for 6 years because he did not yet know how to go back into it, and who had led her slowly, carefully, in the particular indirect way of someone who had learned not to trust direct approaches, let her be the person who came with him. She loved him with the specific certainty of someone who had not been looking for it and had found it anyway, the way you find things when you are paying the right kind of attention. And she understood with equal certainty that she was not going to say so. "Thank you," she said, "for addressing it." He nodded. "The box pattern will be fully visible by next week," she said. "If you want to see it from the upper window before the gathering." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved through his expression, something she recognized now and could name the specific look of a man standing at the edge of a thing he wants to say, and has decided for reasons she could not entirely see not to say yet. "I know," he said. "I've been watching it emerge." He went back to the house. Eleanor stayed in the garden until the last light was gone. He spoke at the Magistrates' Association gathering. She was not present. It was not a forum she had been invited to, and she would not have attended if she had been. But she learned what happened from Thomas, who had it from Mr. Holt, who had been in the room. Nathaniel Whitcombe had presented the commission formally, as he had said he would. He had described Eleanor's credentials with specificity. He had referenced the Ashworth Commission and 2 others, named the professional associations she held membership in, and explained with the particular economy of a man who does not over-explain things, the precise nature of a professional restoration engagement, and why the suggestion that it required supervision reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the practice. And then he had said, and this was the part that Mr. Holt had found worth passing on, that Miss Eleanor Whitfield was the finest professional he had encountered in the entire course of his management of the estate, that her work would be a legacy for the Whitcombe grounds for the next century, and that he considered it one of the better decisions he had made in recent years to have engaged her. Mrs. Crane had not spoken further on the matter. Eleanor sat with this for a long time. She thought about cost, not the cost to her, the cost to him. A public statement of that kind in that forum 3 weeks before a county gathering at which the Hartford family would be present was not a neutral action. It was a choice. It positioned her publicly and deliberately as someone worthy of defense by the Duke of Whitcombe, which was in the social economy of the county, a form of endorsement that carried weight far beyond the professional context he had framed it in. He had to have known that. She thought he chose it anyway. She thought I still cannot tell him, because the knowing did not change the structure of the situation. He was a man with an estate and a name and a family that expected him to make decisions that served both. She was a woman on a temporary commission with a lease problem and 3 employees and a practice built on proving again and again that she deserved to be in rooms that had not originally intended to include her. The asymmetry was real. It did not dissolve because she had recognized what she felt. She went back to work. It was in the final week before the gathering on a quiet Tuesday afternoon that Nathaniel took her to the Western Garden. He did not announce it in advance. He simply appeared in the archive doorway at 2 o'clock and said, "Come." And she set down what she was holding and went. He led her through the south grounds and along the old path she had discovered on her own, in the first week the path she had followed to the gate that opened onto his mother's garden. He opened the gate himself, with the key that must have been in his coat pocket, which meant he had brought it deliberately. He held the gate for her. She stepped through. The western garden in late November was not beautiful in the obvious sense. The flowering season was long past, and what remained was structure, the forms of the plantings in their winter clarity, the bones of the original design more visible now than they would be in summer. But it was the bones that told the story. And standing inside it for the first time, standing at the center rather than at the gate, she could see what the blueprint had described and what she had understood only in plan view, now rendered in 3 dimensions. The garden had been designed around a central point, not around a feature, around a position, a specific place in the middle of the space where if you stood and turned slowly, every sightline resolved into something intentional. The plantings framed the views. The paths led toward this center and away from it with equal grace. It was the kind of design that could only have been created by someone who had stood in this place for a very long time and understood it from the inside out. She stood in the center and turned slowly. He was watching her. "She designed it to be experienced from here," she said. "Yes." He was standing at the edge of the central space at the boundary between the path and the planted beds. He had his hands in his coat pockets, the posture she had come to associate with something being managed internally. She said a garden should have a heart, a place where all the separate decisions become a single intention. Eleanor looked at the climbing roses on the far wall, the ones she had seen being trained in the early weeks by hands that knew what they were doing. Close up, she could see more clearly. They had been trained recently carefully, with the specific knowledge of the plant's preferred direction. Not by a professional, by someone who had learned it over time and alone. "You've been tending it," she said. "Yes. Since she died. Since I came back after she died." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what else to do with it. I couldn't change it, and I couldn't let it go. So I kept it." He looked at the climbing roses. "I learned what I needed to learn to keep it." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about a man who had studied architecture and given it up and kept the instinct alive in the management of an estate, who had learned his mother's gardening techniques alone and in private and never mentioned it, who carried the weight of duty so completely that it had become indistinguishable from his personality, and yet left books on archive tables and found physicians for kitchen maids' mothers, and stood up in front of the County Magistrates Association to defend the reputation of a woman on a temporary commission because it was the right thing to do. "She would be glad you kept it," Eleanor said. He looked at the garden. "I hope so." A pause. "I used to come here and talk to her. The way I used to sit on the brick edging and talk while she worked. I would stand in the middle." He moved slightly, almost involuntarily, toward the central space. "And I would tell her things. How the estate was going. How Oliver, my nephew, was doing in his schooling. Things I didn't tell anyone else because there was nowhere else to put them." Eleanor was very still. "You were alone with it for a long time," she said gently. "Yes." He looked at the center of the garden, at the position she had been standing in when she turned, and all the sightlines resolved. "Since you arrived." He stopped. She waited. "Since you arrived," he said again, with the careful precision of someone choosing the least defended version of a true thing. "This estate has felt different. The gardens, the archive, even the rooms that have been closed." He paused. "You move through this place as though it deserves attention, as though every part of it is worth seeing." He looked at her. "You have made it feel inhabited again, not preserved, lived in." She held his gaze. "Nathaniel," she began, "I am not saying it to—" He stopped, looked away, looked back. "There are things I cannot say simply because they are true. The gathering is in 12 days. The Hartford family will be there. My cousins have made their expectations clear, and they are not unreasonable expectations, given everything." He looked at the climbing roses again, at the careful trained form of something growing in the right direction. "I am telling you what is true, because you are someone who values truth, and because—" He paused once more. Because you are the first person who has made me understand that this garden was not meant to stay closed. Eleanor breathed. She thought about the blueprint. For Nathaniel, when he finally allows himself to live, she thought about all the things she could say and all the things that said them would cost. I know, she said quietly. I can see that. He nodded. He said nothing else. They stood in his mother's garden in the late November light, at the center of a design built around a specific point where all the separate intentions resolved, and neither of them said the thing that was taking up all the available space between them. She found the letter on a Wednesday. She had been working through the final section of the archive materials related to the personal correspondence of the Whitcombe family, which she had left for last because they were the most delicate and the least relevant to the formal restoration, when she found it in the back of a document box labeled Correspondence 1889, filed behind a series of letters that she had already assessed and rehoused. It was addressed in a hand she recognized immediately as the same hand that had signed the blueprint. The same warmth in the letters, the same particular formation of the capital N. The envelope was addressed, "For anyone who loves him enough to find this." Eleanor set down everything she was holding. She looked at the envelope for a long time. She thought about the boundary of her work, the principle she had maintained across every commission she had ever undertaken, the discipline of knowing what was hers to see and what was not. She thought about the letter in the binding of James Blackthorne's ledger, from a completely different story, from a completely different woman's life, and she thought, no. This is not that. This envelope was addressed to her, not by name, but by condition. She was whatever else she was, someone who had loved him enough to find this. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages. She read it slowly, in the particular way she read things that mattered, without skimming, without looking ahead, giving each sentence the full attention it had been written to receive. The letter was from his mother. Written from the date at the top, 4 months before she died. Written to the person she had believed would one day come, the person she had told Nathaniel about in the inscription on the blueprint, the person she had understood her son needed even when he did not yet understand it himself. She wrote about Nathaniel as only someone who had known him his whole life could write, with the specific accuracy of someone who had watched him become himself and had seen both the beauty and the cost of what he had built. She wrote that he had learned his father's discipline, but not his father's coldness, and that the tragedy of it was that from the outside, the two were nearly indistinguishable. She wrote that he had never learned to ask for anything for himself, and that this was the wound she was most afraid would not heal. She wrote, "He will give you everything. He will not ask for anything in return. You will have to teach him that asking is not weakness, that choosing his own happiness is not a betrayal of everyone who depends on him." She wrote, "I was never meant to inherit only a fortune. He was meant to build a life filled with love. If you have found this, please remind him." Eleanor sat in the archive of Whitcombe Estate with the letter in her hands and felt something settle into place that had been waiting. She understood now for this specific moment of settling. She thought about 12 days. She thought about the Hartford family. She thought about a man who would give everything and ask for nothing, and believed she was now certain that choosing himself was a form of betrayal he was not entitled to commit. She folded the letter carefully. She held it for a long moment in both hands. He was never meant to inherit only a fortune. Outside the archive window, the winter grounds of Whitcombe Estate lay in the gray December light. The east garden, almost finished. The west garden tended in private love. The whole estate waiting for something it did not yet know how to name. 12 days. Eleanor set the letter on the table. She looked at it for one more moment. Then she went to find him. She did not find him that afternoon. She had gone to the library first, then the study, then the east corridor, where he sometimes stood in the early evenings, with the particular quality of stillness that meant he was thinking, rather than simply being still. He was in none of these places. Thomas, encountered in the kitchen yard, said that the master had ridden out to the North Fields on an estate matter and was not expected back before dinner. Eleanor stood in the kitchen yard with the letter in her coat pocket and the December cold settling around her, and made herself breathe deliberately for a moment. Then she went back to the archive. She set the letter on the corner of her table carefully as she set down everything that mattered, and she looked at it for a moment, and then she covered it with her sketchbook and went back to the final section of the restoration documentation. Because the work was still there. The work would always still be there, patient and specific, and requiring her attention regardless of what was happening in the larger landscape of things. She worked until dinner. At dinner he was present, returned from the North Fields, still in his riding coat, with the particular quality of someone who has been outside in cold open air, and has not yet entirely come back to the indoor version of himself. He ate with the distracted efficiency of a man whose attention was partly elsewhere. Eleanor ate and watched him with the peripheral attention she had developed over weeks of learning his specific rhythms, and she tried to determine what the North Fields had produced in him, whether the distance had been practical, or whether it had been the other kind of distance, the kind that a man takes when he needs to be somewhere that does not require him to manage his own expression. She could not tell. After dinner, he went to the study. She went to the archive. She retrieved the letter and held it in her hands for a long time, and then she put it back in the document box and covered it properly with archival tissue and told herself she would try again tomorrow. Tomorrow became 2 days. 2 days became 4. She was aware with the part of herself that catalogued things accurately that she was waiting. Not for courage. She was not a woman who confused waiting with cowardice. She was waiting for the right moment, which was different. The right moment was not about her readiness. It was about whether the letter could be received properly, whether the circumstances around the receiving would give it room to matter in the way it was meant to matter. The circumstances in the week before the December gathering were not providing this room. The estate was changing. Daily the preparations for the county gathering created a new quality of occupation deliveries, arriving additional staff engaged for the evening. Mrs. Aldrin moving through the house with the particular efficiency of someone whose organizational intelligence was finally being given a challenge proportionate to its capacity. Nathaniel was in constant motion between the practical demands of the preparation and the estate business that did not pause because a social occasion was approaching. He came to the East Garden twice in that final week. The first time he stood at the edge of the finished parterre and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. The box pattern was fully revealed. Now the complete secondary geometry, visible at last. The garden restored to its original double design. The thing that had been buried under years of neglect come back to the surface with the patience that good restoration always required. "It's finished," he said. "Almost," she said. 2 more days of detail work, the edging on the south section, the final training of the roses along the east wall. "But the design is there." "The design has always been there," she said. "We only uncovered it." He looked at the garden for a long time. "She would have said that was the point," he said. Eleanor did not answer. She continued working, and he stood at the edge of the garden, and they existed in the comfortable silence that had become over weeks the most natural form of their company. The silence of 2 people who had stopped needing to fill the space between them. He left after 20 minutes without saying anything further. The second time he came, it was early morning before Thomas and William arrived. He brought 2 cups of tea from the kitchen, the deliberate considered gesture of someone who had decided to do something small and had done it, and set one on the corner of her supply case without comment. She accepted it. They drank their tea in the East Garden in the December cold, looking at the parterre in the thin morning light, and he said, "The Hartford family arrives the day after tomorrow." "I know," she said. "Charles and Cecilia will be there." "Yes." A pause. He held the cup with both hands, the way people hold warm things when the air is cold. "Eleanor." She looked at him. He looked at the garden. There was something in his expression that she had not seen before. Not the managed composure, not the careful distance, but something older and less protected. The expression of a man standing at the edge of a decision he has been approaching for a long time, and has finally reached close enough to feel its full weight. He said, "I want you to know that what has happened in this garden, what you have done here, is not something I will forget." She heard everything that was under the words, the architecture of what was not being said. "I know," she said gently. He nodded. He took the cup when she had finished and went back to the house, And Eleanor looked at the finished parterre in the morning light, and thought about a mother's letter, and the right moment, and whether the right moment was the kind of thing that arrived, or the kind of thing that had to be made. The 14th of December arrived with a clear, cold sky, and the specific quality of winter light that made the grounds of Whitcombe Estate look like something painted rather than real. Eleanor was up before anyone else. She walked the east garden one final time in the early dark, with a lantern moving slowly along the path she had walked 100 times over the past 3 months. She stopped at the southeast corner with its 2-century-old brick edging. She stopped at the central parterre, where the box hedging formed its quiet, precise secondary geometry beneath the larger design. She stopped at the east wall where the roses had been trained along the new support she had built in the final week, the canes angled for the winter, the whole structure ready to bloom in the spring, into something that would be better than it had been even at the garden's previous height. She stood at the entrance of the parterre and looked at the whole of it. She had done this work. She allowed herself in the quiet of that morning to feel the full weight of it. The 3 months of early mornings and cold afternoons, and careful attention, and the specific satisfaction of looking at something broken and deciding again and again that it was worth the patience required to make it whole. She had done this. This was hers in the way that work is yours when you have put the best of yourself into it. Whatever happened tonight, this would remain. She went back inside. The guests began arriving at 6. Eleanor had positioned herself by the late afternoon in a practical location, the archive which she had legitimate work to complete, and which happened to be on the east side of the house, away from the main entrance and the gathering noise of arrival. She was not hiding. She was completing her final documentation. The distinction mattered to her even if no one else would have found it particularly significant. She heard the Hartford carriage arrive at 6:30. She recognized it not by sight, but by the particular change in Mrs. Aldrin's instructions to the household staff, which became more precise in the specific way they became more precise when something important was happening. At 7, she heard the gathering move into the dining room. At 7:15, Thomas appeared in the archive doorway. Miss Whitfield. He was in his formal estate livery, which he wore with the same unconcerned dignity he brought to his work clothes. His Grace has asked that you join the gathering after dinner, for the lantern viewing of the east grounds, as the restoration professional. She looked at him. He asked specifically, Thomas said. He said the east garden is your work, and it should be shown by the person who made it. She set down her pen. She looked at her hands for a moment, the hands of a woman who worked with them, whose profession was visible in the calluses and the faint ink stains that didn't entirely wash out, and the specific precision of how she handled things that were fragile. "Tell him I'll be there," she said. Thomas nodded and left. Eleanor closed her documentation folder. She went to her room. She changed into her good dress, the deep blue that had been her mother's altered twice the one she had worn to a different kind of gathering not so long ago, and she did her hair simply without elaboration, in the way she wore it when she wanted to look like herself, rather than like a performance of herself. She looked in the glass. She thought about Cecilia Whitcomb's voice through the drawing-room window. She thought about the archive table and the book left on it without annotation. She thought about a letter addressed to anyone who loved him enough to find it currently in her coat pocket because she had put it there this morning and had not taken it out. She thought, whatever happens tonight, I am not temporary. Not the work. Not the knowing of him. Not the weeks of conversation and silence, and his mother's garden, and the brick edging, and the tea in the cold morning air. None of it was temporary. She went downstairs. The lantern viewing began at 9. The dining room had produced 30 people in the various states of post-dinner sociability, warm, slightly loosened by wine and conversation, ready to be impressed by something, if something was available to impress them. Eleanor arrived as they were gathering at the garden entrance, and she took her position at the front of the group with the professional composure of someone who had stood in assessment rooms for years and understood that authority in a professional context was something you demonstrated rather than announced. The lanterns were lit. The garden was, she felt it before she registered it, fully extraordinary. She had known it was good. She had not quite known how it would look like this in winter darkness with the lantern light warm against the stone, and the hedge forms the box pattern, emerging from below as the light caught it at the right angle. The roses trained along the east wall, casting their shadow patterns onto the pale stone behind them. It looked in the lantern light the way it must have looked in its best years. Not a restored garden, not a recovered garden, but simply a garden that had always been this, and was this now, and would be this again in the spring. She heard the sounds from the gathering, the specific quality of appreciation that moves through a group of people when they encounter something genuinely beautiful without having fully anticipated it. She began to speak. She explained the history of the design, the original Georgian structure, the secondary box pattern added 30 years later, the Victorian additions, including the rose standards and the east wall training. She explained the restoration decisions, what had been preserved, what had been rebuilt, what had been discovered in the process of uncovering what was already there. She spoke with the authority of someone who had spent 3 months learning this garden from the inside out, and she spoke about it the way she always spoke about things. She had spent time properly understanding with the particular clarity of genuine knowledge. She was aware throughout of Nathaniel. He was at the edge of the group, not beside her, not performing the role of host in the immediate space, but present in the way he was always present with his full attention and no visible expression of what the attention was producing. She could feel his focus the way she could feel the cold, not intrusively, but as a quality of the air. The Hartford family was near the front of the group. Eleanor had identified them immediately, a couple of perhaps 50, and a daughter who was perhaps 24, elegantly dressed, with the confident grace of someone who had grown up knowing her place in rooms was secure. She was not unkind looking. She was not everything the situation required her to be, to serve as an obstacle. She was simply a young woman in a coat who had no particular involvement in the situation, except as a piece in an arrangement that was being made around her, which Eleanor found herself unexpectedly feeling sorry about. When the viewing concluded and the group turned back toward the house, Charles Whitcombe positioned himself beside Nathaniel with the smoothness of a man who had planned the moment in advance. She heard him say quietly, but not quietly enough, "Now is the right time. Bring her forward. Let me make the introduction properly." She kept walking. She was at the edge of the terrace when she heard it stop. Not a sound, the cessation of a sound. The specific quality of a gathering that has been moving in a direction and has suddenly, without announcement, altered course. She turned. Nathaniel had stopped walking. Charles was beside him, and the Hartford father had moved forward, and the daughter was being brought to the front of the group with the gentle social pressure of a choreography that everyone except one person was performing correctly. Nathaniel was standing still. He was looking at Eleanor. Not at the Hartford daughter. Not at Charles. At Eleanor across the length of the terrace, with the full attention that was his truest form of communication. The attention that did not require words to say something completely. She held it for a moment. Then she turned and walked toward the garden entrance, because whatever was happening needed to happen without her standing in the middle of it, and because she was not going to be the scene that Charles Whitcombe narrated as the disruption. She was at the garden gate when she heard his voice. Charles. Quiet. Level. The tone she recognized as the one that ended things. "I need a moment." Then footsteps, and not the ones she expected, not Charles following to argue, not the Hartford father pressing forward. Nathaniel's footsteps, coming toward her. She did not turn immediately. She stood at the gate of the east garden with her hand on the cold iron and let him reach her. "Eleanor," he said. She turned. I was standing 2 feet from her in the lantern light from the terrace with the December cold around them, and the sounds of 30 people on the terrace behind him, in the specific silence of a gathering that is pretending not to be watching something. He looked, she thought, like a man who had made a decision and was standing in the first moment after making it, before the consequences had arrived in the brief, clear space of the choice itself. "I told Charles I would not be making an announcement this evening," he said. She looked at him. "I told him that the Hartford arrangement, which I had not agreed to and had not been given the opportunity to decline through the correct channels, was not an arrangement I intend to pursue." He paused. He was not pleased. "No," she said. "I imagine not. The business connections that were contingent on the match will need to be restructured. Some of them may not survive restructuring." He said it with the calm of someone who had done the calculation in advance and arrived at this moment, having already accepted the sum. My cousins will be unhappy for some time. Nathaniel, I am not telling you this to ask for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I am telling you because you have been in this estate for 3 months and you have treated everything in it, the garden, the archive, this house with more honesty than anyone I have encountered in years. And I am not willing to make a major decision about my life and then present you with its existence as a fact without telling you the truth of how it came to be. She looked at him. She felt the letter in her coat pocket. I know something about the way you make decisions, she said carefully. I have been watching it for 3 months. You are very good at making the right decision for everyone except yourself. She paused. Is this decision for everyone else again? Rejecting the arrangement because it is the honorable thing rather than because you want something different. He was quiet for a moment. Both things, he said. It is both things. He looked at the garden gate behind her at the east garden in the lantern light at the work she had made from the neglect she had found. I have spent 12 years managing this estate for what it requires. For what my father built, and what my family expects, and what the county observes. I have been very good at it. He paused. And it has been empty. She waited. Not the estate, he said. The life inside it. He looked at her. Since you arrived, I have come to the garden every morning, not because it required my attention, but because you were there. I have sat in the archive, not because the documents needed reviewing, but because that is where you work in the evenings, and the quality of the air in that room is different when you are in it. He stopped, started differently. You have made me look forward to mornings. I did not know I had stopped doing that. Eleanor held his gaze. She thought about the letter in her pocket. She reached into her coat and took it out. She held it for a moment, and then she held it out to him. He looked at it. At the envelope, at the handwriting, and she saw it happen, the recognition, the specific thing that moved through him when he understood whose hand had written it. He looked at her. Where? He said. The archive, she said gently. In the correspondence box from 1889. She addressed it to anyone who loved him enough to find it. She paused. I found it. He took it from her hands. He stood in the cold December night, and he looked at his mother's handwriting on the envelope for a long time. Then he looked at Eleanor. She had said enough. She understood this. The thing that was happening now was not hers to manage or to fill with words. She had brought him what she found. What he did with it was his. She said, "Take the time you need. I'll be here." She went back to the terrace. She did not know how long he stood at the garden gate. She returned to the gathering and accepted a glass of wine from a passing tray and spoke briefly to Mrs. Aldrin about the evening's arrangements, and then to Thomas about the lanterns and the 30 people on the terrace, did what 30 people do when something has happened that they are still interpreting. They spoke to each other and watched the periphery and recalibrated in the particular social machinery of people who are simultaneously participants and audience. Charles Whitcombe approached her. He was a man who had been managing social situations for 45 years, and he brought to this one the specific composure of someone who had not yet decided which form of pressure to apply. He stood beside her and looked at the east garden and said with surface pleasantness, "Extraordinary restoration. You clearly have considerable talent." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "Nathaniel thinks highly of your work. He has been generous in his acknowledgement of it." Charles looked at her directly for a moment. She met the look without adjustment. "You understand," he said, "that this estate has responsibilities that extend beyond a single man's preferences. There are obligations, business, family, social, that a restoration professional, however gifted, may not fully appreciate from inside the commission." "I appreciate them," Eleanor said. "I also appreciate that obligation and happiness are not always as irreconcilable as they are sometimes presented." Charles looked at her with the expression of someone encountering an argument they had not prepared for. "The Hartford family is a very good family," he said. "I'm sure they are," Eleanor said. "The daughter seems like a thoughtful person. She deserves someone who chose her rather than someone who accepted her." Charles was quiet for a moment. "You are very direct," he said. "It's more efficient," she said. He went to find his wife. Nathaniel returned from the garden gate 40 minutes after he had gone to it. Eleanor did not see him return. She was in conversation with one of the county families about the historical significance of the parterre design, but she felt the change in the room's atmosphere that always accompanied his arrival, the particular quality of attention that gathered around him without requiring any action on his part. When she turned, he was across the terrace, standing with the Hartford father. She watched. She could not hear the exchange from this distance. She could read the posture of it, the Hartford father's initial expression, the shift that occurred after perhaps 2 minutes of conversation, the controlled response of a man being told something he had not anticipated but was too experienced in social situations to react to visibly. There was a handshake at the end. Brief. Correct. Then Nathaniel turned. He moved through the gathering with the direct purposefulness of someone who had finished one set of tasks and was attending to the next, and the gathering parted for him in the way it always did, not from fear as it might have once, but from the specific form of respect that a room gives to someone who has just done something difficult with complete composure. He reached her side. He said quietly for only her, "I have spoken with Mr. Hartford. The arrangement is concluded." How did he receive it? With more grace than I deserved, he said. He said that he had observed his daughter's expression when the suggestion was first made and had entertained his own reservations. He was generous about it. Eleanor exhaled. "Charles is going to require a different conversation," he said. "A longer one, not tonight." "No," she agreed. "Not tonight." He looked at her. In the lantern light of the December terrace with 30 people around them and the east garden behind her, and the cold coming in from the grounds. He looked at her with the expression she had first seen at the garden gate when he held his mother's letter. The expression of someone who has set something down that he has been carrying for a very long time and is standing in the unfamiliar space of having put it down. "The letter," he said. She waited. "She knew," he said. "She always knew." His voice was entirely level with the specific levelness of something being held very carefully. "She wrote about things I have never said aloud to anyone, about the way I was afraid that choosing something for myself was a form of betrayal of everyone who depended on me." He paused. She said that was the thing she was most afraid would not heal." "It can heal," Eleanor said quietly. She said the same. He looked at the garden. She said the person who found the letter would know how. He looked back at Eleanor. "You already did. You've been showing me for 3 months without either of us naming it." Eleanor held his gaze. She thought now. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Before anything else is said, I need you to hear it correctly." He waited. "I am not staying because you defended my reputation before the Magistrates Association," she said. "I am not staying because you found my father's business and kept it alive, which was one of the most genuinely kind things anyone has ever done for me, and I will never forget it. I am not staying because of the letter, or because the estate needs someone, or because you have rejected an arrangement that would have been practical for everyone except you." She paused. "I am not staying because you saved something. Do you understand?" He looked at her. "I will stay," she said, "if you choose me as an equal, not as the woman who restored your garden, not as the person who found the right letter at the right time, not as someone who came into your life during a difficult period and helped things become better." She held his gaze steadily. "I will stay if you choose the person I actually am, including the work and the business, and the 3 women who depend on it, and the fact that I will always look at a damaged thing and want to understand it, and the fact that I will always tell you the truth, even when it would be easier not to." She paused. "All of it. Equal. Or I go back to London in January, and we are both grateful for what this was." The terrace was very quiet around them. He was looking at her with the full attention. Not the managed attention. Not the studied composure. Simply him. The man she had first glimpsed crouching by the old brick edging, and then found again, layer by layer, in the archive and the garden, and the evening walks, and the quiet of shared work. "I know who you are," he said. His voice was quiet and entirely without performance. "I have known since the 3rd day. since you told me that you looked at damaged things and tried to understand what they had been before they became what they were." He paused. "I would like very much to be the man you look at that way for the rest of both our lives." She breathed. "That is not an answer to what I said," she said. "No." The almost smile, more complete than she had seen it even now, even here. "It is an addition to one." He looked at her directly. "I choose you, entirely, as an equal in the work, in the decisions, in the life, all of it." A pause. "Though I should tell you that equal in practice will probably mean that you are better at most things, and I am simply grateful to be in the same rooms." Eleanor felt something she had been holding for a very long time release its structure inside her chest. "You are better at the roses," she said. "I have had more practice." "You will have to teach me." "I will," he said, gladly. Around them 30 people were observing this exchange with the specific quality of attention of people who understand they are watching something real, not a scene, not a performance, not the social machinery of the county doing its ordinary work. Something that had come to the surface through months of careful, quiet effort and was now simply here, present and visible in the lantern light of a December evening on a terrace where an estate had finally entirely come back to life. Charles Whitcombe was watching from the far end of the terrace with the expression of a man recalculating. Mrs. Aldrin was watching from the doorway with the expression of a woman confirming a conclusion she had reached some weeks ago. Thomas was watching from the garden gate with the corner of his mouth doing its small, precise thing. Eleanor looked at Nathaniel. She looked at him the way she had always looked at things that mattered, with the full, careful attention of someone who understood that the most significant information was often what had survived beneath the surface of everything that had happened to it. What she saw was a man who had finally, after a very long time, decided to choose himself, and had chosen her at the same time. She thought, there it is. There it always was. "The archive needs a proper cataloging system," she said. "The current organization is functional, but not optimal. If I am going to be working in it long term, we should build something that will last another century." He looked at her. Something in his expression was the fullest version of every almost smile she had watched him manage over 3 months completed, now entirely unmanaged, simply present. "Yes," he said, "we should." The December night settled around them. The lanterns burned. The east garden waited restored and patient in its winter darkness, full of the spring it had already decided to produce. And Nathaniel Whitcombe, who had spent 12 years managing a life instead of living, one stood on the terrace of his estate beside the woman who had taught him the difference, and felt for the first time in longer than he could accurately remember that the weight he had been carrying had found somewhere proper to be set down. Not lost. Not abandoned. Simply finished. The choice had been made. Now the life could begin. Charles Whitcombe did not speak to Nathaniel for 6 weeks. Eleanor knew this because Nathaniel told her in the particular direct way he had of presenting difficult facts without surrounding them with the architecture of complaint. He said it on a January morning in the library, where they had taken to meeting after breakfast to discuss the day's work. Both his and hers. The estate management and the restoration planning, laid out together on the large table, with the unself-conscious practicality of people who have decided that their lives are going to be organized around shared purpose, rather than separate spheres. 6 weeks, she said. Probably more. Charles is thorough in his displeasures. He moved a set of ledgers to make room for her survey notes. The Hartford connection will need to be rebuilt through different channels. There is a business arrangement with a family in Bristol that may serve the same practical function without the social component. He paused. "I have written to their representative." Eleanor looked at him. "You've already started restructuring. The week after the gathering." He sat down with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in his own chair, in his own library, in his own life. The arrangements were always about the business first. The social requirement was imposed on top of a practical foundation. Remove the social requirement, and the foundation remains workable. He looked at the ledgers. It requires effort, but it does not require sacrifice. She thought about all the years he had believed the sacrifice was the point, that the cost of the decision was what made the decision correct. Cecilia wrote, he added without particular inflection. She said that she hoped when the situation had settled that she would find it possible to reconsider her initial assessment. Of me. Of the situation in general. He looked up. I think it was the closest she is capable of coming at present to acknowledging that she was wrong. That's something, Eleanor said. It is, he agreed. She is not a malicious woman. She is a woman who has spent her life managing within a set of expectations so thoroughly that she has difficulty distinguishing them from her own opinions. He paused. I have some experience with that condition. Eleanor looked at him. Yes, she said. You do. He picked up the day's correspondence. She picked up her survey notes. The library settled into its working quiet, the particular quality of silence between people who are doing separate things, in complete comfort with each other's presence, and outside the tall windows, the January grounds of Whitcombe Estate lay under their covering of hard frost, and the east garden waited bare and precise for the spring it had already decided to become. They were married in March. Not at the county church with 30 families watching, and the social machinery of Whitcombe Estate performing its public function, but at the small chapel on the estate grounds, a building Eleanor had discovered in her first month set back from the formal garden path, its interior plainly beautiful in the way of things built for use rather than display. It held 20 people comfortably. They invited 20 people. Mrs. Aldrin was there in a gray coat that was her version of formality. Thomas was there with the corner of his mouth doing its quiet, satisfied thing throughout the entire ceremony. Mr. Holt attended with the expression of a man who had made a professional recommendation that had exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Margaret came up from London with the 3 women from the Whitfield archive in Bindery, now operating in its newly secured premises, the lease renewed at terms that Margaret had negotiated with the quiet ferocity of someone who had learned from Eleanor how to look at a damaged situation and determine what it was actually worth. Lady Margaret Blackthorne sent a gift and a letter. Eleanor had met her twice in the months since the December gathering, in contexts that confirmed the impression formed at a different estate in a different set of circumstances. A woman of tremendous strategic intelligence and genuine warmth who had spent decades watching people she loved suffer unnecessarily and had developed in response an extremely effective approach to helping them stop. The gift was a botanical text, 17th century, in remarkable condition, from a collection Eleanor had once mentioned wanting to locate. The letter said simply, I thought this belonged with you. Some things take longer than expected to reach their proper home. Eleanor put the letter with the others. She kept the ones worth keeping. Charles and Cecilia Whitcombe did not attend the wedding. 6 months later, they came to the estate for a weekend visit, and Charles shook Nathaniel's hand in the entrance hall, with the specific quality of a man completing an internal recalculation that had taken longer than he had perhaps intended. He looked at Eleanor with the expression of someone who had expected on some level to find confirmation of his original assessment, and had instead found the opposite of it everywhere he looked. He said, The East Garden is extraordinary. Thank you, Eleanor said. Nathaniel tells me it was a secondary design, a hidden pattern, that it was always there but required restoration to be seen. Yes. He looked at her steadily. I think, he said with the careful enunciation of a man choosing words, he will have to live with, that I was not looking at the right things last year, when I formed my conclusions. It's a common difficulty, Eleanor said. With gardens and with other things. Charles nodded once with the formality of someone filing a verdict. Cecilia embraced her. It was brief and slightly awkward and entirely genuine, the specific quality of an embrace from a woman who does not often offer them and has decided that this particular one is overdue. Eleanor received it without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. The spring came to Whitcombe Estate, the way it had always come, in accumulations, in the particular advancing of warmth that turns mud to growth and bare structure to flower. But this spring was different from the previous ones in the way that springs are different when the person observing them has changed in the winter preceding. Eleanor stood at the east garden entrance on the first morning in April, when the box hedging showed new growth, the faintest, most deliberate green at the tips of the recently restored plants, and she felt something she had not permitted herself to feel when she first arrived at this estate, which was the specific satisfaction of belonging to a place. Not owning it, not being owned by it. the particular satisfaction of being part of something that was itself in the fullest sense, and being part of its fullness. The parterre was beautiful in the spring light. She had known it would be. She had designed for this, the seasonal progression of the planting the way the box pattern would read differently in the varying light of different months. The roses along the east wall preparing to bloom in a sequence she had planned, so that the color would arrive gradually building through June, into the full expression of July. She had done this work. The spring was in a sense something she had made, not the spring itself, but the form it would take in this garden, the particular beauty it would produce. She heard his footsteps on the path. He came to stand beside her at the garden entrance carrying 2 cups of tea from the kitchen in the domestic, unceremonious way that had become one of her favorite things about mornings at Whitcombe Estate. She accepted her cup. They stood together and looked at the garden in the April light. "Thomas says the north corner roses are showing bud," he said. "Earlier than I expected. The south-facing wall is warmer than the plans indicated. She always said it was. She used to start the seedlings for that corner 2 weeks ahead of everywhere else." He drank his tea. "I didn't know that would still be true." "The wall hasn't changed." "No," he said. "Some things don't." She looked at him. I was watching the garden with the particular quality of attention she had come to understand as his form of contentment, the full presence of someone who is at this moment entirely where he intends to be. He had looked this way increasingly often in the past months. She noticed it each time without commenting on it, in the same way she had learned not to comment on things that were best allowed to exist without being made subjects of discussion. He was happy. The specific, unforced, unmanaged happiness of a man who had stopped performing duty and started living it. She looked back at the garden. "The academy students arrive on Thursday," she said. "I know. Mrs. Aldrin has prepared the West Wing workrooms." He paused. "Thomas's sister is considering applying for the second intake." Eleanor looked at him. "I didn't know she was interested in horticultural work." "She's interested in botanic illustration," he said. "She has been drawing plants in the kitchen garden for years. Nobody suggested it might be a professional skill." He drank his tea. "I thought you might be able to tell her whether it qualifies." Eleanor thought about a girl drawing plants in the kitchen garden because she loved doing it and had never been told the doing of it could be a life. "Yes," she said. "It qualifies." The Whitcombe Academy of Restoration and Design opened formally in the spring of that year in 3 rooms in the West Wing, with good north-facing light and storage space for materials, and a workroom large enough for 6 students to practice simultaneously without crowding. Eleanor had spent the winter designing the curriculum with the same methodical attention she brought to every restoration project, beginning with the structural foundation and building upward, making sure each element supported the next, creating something that would hold not just for the first intake, but for the generations of intake that would follow. She had written to 3 women in London she had known professionally for years: a textile conservator, a bookbinder with 20 years of practice, a paper archivist who had trained under one of the foremost practitioners in the field, and each of them had agreed to come to Whitcombe for a week apiece to offer instruction in their specific disciplines. She had also written to the professional associations that had declined her own applications twice in her 20s. She had written with the directness of a woman who no longer had anything to prove and considerable standing from which to make the request. She had asked them to consider formal affiliation with the Academy, an affiliation that would allow its graduates to qualify for membership through a structured examination pathway. 2 of the 3 associations had agreed within the month. The third had taken longer and had ultimately agreed also after a second letter from Eleanor and an accompanying letter from Nathaniel that was brief, courteous, and communicated in the specific economy of a man of considerable standing. Precisely what the cost of continued refusal would be to the association's relationship with the Whitcombe estate and its network. Eleanor had read the letter before he sent it. She had looked at him when she finished. "You didn't ask whether I wanted you to send it," she said. "No," he agreed. "I asked whether you wanted the affiliation." "That's not the same thing." "I know." He held her gaze. "You told me in December that you wanted equality. I am attempting to understand what equality means in practice, which is more complex than it seemed in principle. I believe in this case." He paused with the precision of someone who has done the internal work. "The letter was mine to send, because the relationship with the association is mine to manage, and the request was to support your work, which is something I am always going to do. The same way you are always going to tell me when you think I am approaching something incorrectly." She looked at him. "Was I approaching it incorrectly?" he asked. She thought about the third association. About the 10 years of its quiet, consistent exclusion of women who were doing work it claimed to represent. About the graduates who would now be able to qualify through the academy pathway. "No," she said. "But I need you to ask next time." "Yes," he said. "I know." This was the texture of their life together. Not smooth, not frictionless, not the performance of an arrangement that both parties found convenient. It was the particular texture of two people learning in real time what it meant to build something together rather than alongside each other. There were disagreements. There were conversations that required returning to the following morning, because neither of them had reached the right words the night before. There was the ongoing negotiation of two people who had each spent years becoming precisely who they were and were now working out which parts of that precision needed to be maintained individually and which could be shared. It was, Eleanor thought, the most genuinely interesting work she had ever done. It was also the most satisfying. The first intake of the academy was 6 students. Eleanor had not chosen them primarily on the basis of prior training. She had chosen them after careful consideration of the applications on the basis of the quality of attention visible in their materials. Not their credentials, not their connections, not the elegance of their application letters, though several had written with considerable eloquence. She had looked for the specific quality that she had always looked for in work that mattered. The willingness to sit with something long enough to understand it fully before deciding what to do with it. She found it in each of the 6. A woman of 32, who had spent 6 years doing unpaid conservation work for the local historical society, while her husband's income kept the household running, and who had produced in that time 3 restorations of considerable technical sophistication that had never been formally recognized because she had no institutional affiliation. A young woman of 20 who had taught herself bookbinding from library texts and had been doing commission work under her uncle's name because no one would hire a 20-year-old woman directly. Thomas's sister Margaret, who drew plants with the specific accuracy of someone who had always understood that accuracy was a form of love. And 3 others each with their particular form of skill that had never been given the right structure to become fully itself. Eleanor taught them the way her father had taught her. Not by instruction delivered from a position of authority, but by working alongside them, by bringing her own current projects into the workroom, and letting them observe, and then attempt, and then refine, and then attempt again, building the knowledge from the inside out, rather than from the surface in. She taught them what she had learned from years of damaged things, that the first task was always to stop the deterioration before attempting the restoration. That you stabilized before you repaired. That understanding the damage was not the same as being defeated by it. That the structure beneath the damage was almost always more intact than the surface suggested. She taught them that their value was not determined by whether anyone had yet recognized it. This was the lesson she returned to in different forms throughout the first term. Not as a speech or a declaration, but woven into the ordinary work of the sessions offered in the specific way of things that are true and practical simultaneously. On the last day of the first term, the woman of 32, whose name was Clara, and who had become in 6 months one of the most technically precise restorers Eleanor had encountered, set down her tools at the end of the session and said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Were you afraid when you started, before anyone knew who you were?" Eleanor considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Every time," she said. "Every commission. Every room I walked into where someone had already decided what I was before I demonstrated what I could do." She paused. "I was afraid, and I did the work anyway, which is the only relationship with fear that produces anything useful." Clara looked at the restoration she had completed that day, a set of 18th century correspondence water, damaged the ink, stabilized the paper, cleaned and rehoused and legible once more. "You made it possible," Clara said. "All of it. This place, the affiliation, the commission work Mr. Vale has been referring. I built the structure, Eleanor said. You are doing the work. Clara shook her head. You know what I mean. Eleanor did know. She sat with it for a moment, the specific feeling of being thanked for something that had cost something by someone for whom the cost had been worth it. She had been learning to receive this with more grace than had come naturally to her in the first years of her life, when receiving anything without immediately offering something in return had felt like an imbalance she could not tolerate. She had been learning that receiving gracefully was its own form of generosity. Yes, she said, I do. Nathaniel changed the way he managed the estate. This was not a dramatic change, not a public announcement or a reformulation of policy. It was the quieter, more durable kind of change that happens when a person's internal priorities shift and the external decisions follow as a natural consequence. He had always known every servant's name. He had always managed the estate's obligations to its dependent families with a consistency that went beyond what duty required. These things did not change because they had never been performances. They had always been the expression of who he actually was operating beneath the surface of the reputation he had maintained for public consumption. What changed was that he stopped maintaining the separation. He stopped managing the distance between the private man and the public. One stopped performing the reserved, controlled authority of the Duke of Whitcombe as a character distinct from the man who tended his mother's roses alone and carried the weight of other people's difficulties without being asked, and knew the name of every child born to an estate family in the past decade. The two became gradually and without ceremony the same person. The county noticed. Not immediately. These things take time in social ecosystems, with long memories and established categories. But over the course of the year that followed the December gathering, the specific quality of Whitcombe Estate's presence in the county landscape shifted. People who had always found Nathaniel Whitcombe difficult to approach found, without entirely understanding why, that he was less difficult than they had believed. Business associates who had conducted their dealings with him through formal channels discovered that direct conversation was more productive and less formidable than they had anticipated. The families connected to the estate, the dependent households, the retired staff, the generations of people whose relationship to Whitcombe went back further than any living memory experienced a quality of relationship with the estate that was warmer, more visible, more present than it had been in the years of maintained distance. The estate began to feel to the people within and adjacent to it, like somewhere that was being lived in by someone who had chosen to live there. This was not a small thing. Eleanor watched it happen with the particular attention she brought to things that were developing correctly. The way she watched the garden in the first weeks of spring, noting each emergence with satisfaction, but without surprise, because she had planned for this, and the plan was working. She had not planned it. She had not engineered him or managed his development or directed his transformation toward a predetermined result. She had only been honest and present and treated him consistently as the person he actually was, rather than the person the county had decided he must be. The transformation had been his own. This was the most important distinction. She had not fixed him. She had not been the instrument of his repair. She had been someone who saw the structure beneath the damage and trusted it enough to say so. And he had done the rest, had decided in his own time and through his own understanding what he wanted his life to actually be. They had helped each other become who they were meant to be. This was not the same as one person saving another. It was something more complex and more equal and more genuinely satisfying than rescue had ever been. In the autumn of the following year, a writer for a regional historical journal came to Whitcombe Estate to document the restoration of the East Parterre. Howe was a careful man, scrupulous in his research, and he spent 3 days at the estate reviewing Eleanor's documentation. The survey notes, the historical cross-references, the photographic record she had maintained throughout the 3 months of active work. He spoke with Thomas, and with Mr. Holt, and with Eleanor herself for 2 long mornings in the archive, and he looked at the finished garden from the upper window with the expression of someone encountering something that exceeded the description he had been given of it. His article, published the following spring, described the Whitcombe Parterre restoration as one of the finest examples of Victorian garden recovery in the region. It named Eleanor as the restoration professional described her credentials and her approach, and dedicated 3 paragraphs to the methodology she had developed for the stabilization and revelation of secondary design elements in historically layered garden spaces. It was, to Eleanor's knowledge, the first time her name had appeared in print in a professional journal. She read it in the library on a Tuesday morning with her tea going cold beside her, and when she finished, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the room and thought about a girl who had grown up in an archivist's house, learning to see past the surface of damaged things, who had spent her 20s proving again and again and again that the work she did was worth doing, who had walked into the east garden of this estate in a professional capacity and had stayed in it for an entirely different set of reasons that she had not anticipated and would not have been able to plan for. She thought about what the article said and what it did not say. What it did not say was that the restoration professional had arrived at this estate as the professional implication of a chain of events involving a cousin's carriage, a social gathering, a matter of debts, and a specific calculation about what help was worth accepting. What it did not say was that she had found a letter in an archive and a blueprint in a storage room, and a man tending his mother's garden alone in the winter, and had understood something important about each of these things. What it did not say was that she had stood on a December terrace and said clearly the thing that needed to be said, that she would stay as an equal or not at all, and had meant it entirely. The article said the work was extraordinary, and the professional who produced it knew what she was doing. This was true. This was enough. She put the article on the table. She picked up her tea. She looked out the library window at the east grounds in their second spring since the restoration, the parterre in its full April expression, the box hedging bright with new growth, the roses beginning their slow color along the east wall, the whole design doing what it had been doing for 2 centuries and would continue to do for another 2 if it was properly tended. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. He came in without announcement, as he always did in his own library, and he sat down in the chair across from her, the chair that was his, as hers was hers, in the comfortable territorial arrangement of people who know which spaces belong to each of them within the space they share. He looked at the article on the table. "Thomas mentioned it arrived," he said, "this morning." And she looked at him. "It's accurate," she said. He looked at her steadily. He knew, because he had learned to read her with the same attention she had always brought to reading him, that accurate was doing a great deal of work in that sentence. "It is considerably more than accurate," he said. "It is the documented record of something that will be studied by people in this field for the next 50 years. You're being generous. I'm being precise." He picked up the article. He read the opening paragraph. He set it back down. "She was right," he said quietly. Eleanor looked at him. "My mother." He looked at the article. "She was right about what the estate could be, what it was meant to be." He paused. "I kept the garden because I didn't know what else to do with the love I had for her, and I closed everything else because I didn't know what else to do with the grief." He looked at Eleanor directly. "You opened it again, all of it." "You opened it," she said. "I only showed you where the door was. The distinction matters to you. It always will." He looked at her for a moment, the long, full look that was still, after all the months of it, the thing she found most difficult to receive without looking away. She had been practicing. She was better at it than she had been. "I know," he said. "That's one of the things I love about you." She looked back at him. She thought about 22 years old in an assessment room. She thought about a 4-year-old dress and a cousin's arm guiding her into the center of a ballroom, and the specific practiced skill of invisibility that she had refined over years of being told in various forms that this was what was required of her. She thought about the first morning she had stood at the gate of this estate's east garden with her supply cases and her rolled plans, and the deliberate intention of doing the work she had come to do. She thought about what she had found inside. Not just the garden. Not just the archive, or the blueprint, or the letter in her coat pocket. The whole of it, the full damaged, structurally sound, entirely worth restoring whole of it. "I know," she said. "That's one of the things I love about you too." People who came to Whitcombe Estate in the years that followed often said the same things. They said the gardens were extraordinary. They said the east parterre was unlike anything they had seen, the double design visible both from the ground and from above. The layered history of it, readable to anyone who looked with sufficient patience. They said the West Garden, opened to visitors 3 years after the restoration, was the most personal piece of landscape design they had encountered. A garden that had been made by someone who understood it from the inside, that spoke of love rather than display. They said the Academy produced the finest restoration professionals in the region. They said its graduates were recognizable by a specific quality in their work, a patience with damaged things, a refusal to replace what could be restored, a tendency to find the structure beneath the surface before deciding what to do with either. They said the estate itself had a quality that was difficult to name precisely. A warmth, a sense of being genuinely inhabited, of being somewhere that the people who lived in it had chosen rather than simply occupied. The kind of warmth that accumulates in a place over years of being lived in by people who are actually present in their own lives. They said that the Duke of Whitcombe was not at all what they had expected. That he was direct and attentive and entirely uninterested in the performance of his own consequence. That the Duchess had a way of looking at things, at the garden, at the Academy students, at the people she spoke with, as though she was genuinely trying to understand what was actually there, rather than confirming what she had already decided. That the two of them together had a quality of relationship that was recognizable even from outside as something real. They heard from Thomas, or from Mrs. Aldrin, or from the Academy students who had been there long enough to know the story, the account of how it had begun. A woman came to restore the gardens. The estate had been in a long period of closure, formerly maintained privately, grieving the public face of the Whitcombe name preserved, while the life inside it waited for something it could not name. She had arrived in winter with her cases and her rolled plans and her specific, patient, completely unperformative way of looking at damaged things. She had found the garden beneath the neglect. She had found the man beneath the reputation. And the man who had spent years protecting everything he had inherited had finally, in the December of that year, understood the difference between preserving a legacy and actually building one. A legacy. Eleanor had once told an intake of Academy students who were assessing a badly damaged set of estate records was not the documents themselves. The documents were the evidence. The legacy was what the documents recorded: the choices that had been made, the things that had been built, the people whose names appeared in the records not as titles, but as participants in the ordinary, essential, irreplaceable work of living. A preserved document with nothing in it was only paper. A damaged document with something real inside, it was always worth restoring. She had built her life on this distinction. She built the Academy on it. She built the partnership with Nathaniel on it, on the conviction that what was real in both of them was worth more than the surfaces that circumstances had required them to maintain, and that two people who understood that about each other could build something together that neither of them could have built alone. She had been right. She was very often right about damaged things. In the April of the 3rd year after the restoration, Nathaniel came to find her in the West Garden. She was at the center of it, the specific point her mother-in-law had designed toward the place where all the separate sight lines resolved into a single intention. She had taken to coming here in the early mornings, sometimes when the light was right and the work could wait for an hour, and she wanted to be somewhere that felt like a good thought made into a physical space. He came through the gate and stopped when he saw where she was standing. He crossed the garden to stand beside her. They stood together in the center of the space his mother had built in the April light in the garden that had been tended alone for 6 years and was now tended by both of them together. The climbing roses in their 2nd year of trained growth along the far wall. The planting in its spring emergence all around them, the whole space doing what it had been designed to do, resolving at its center into something complete. She would have liked this, Eleanor said. Yes. He looked in the roses. She would have said it was about time. She would have been... He smiled. Not the almost smile, not the managed partial version, the complete one. The one that was still after everything. One of her favorite things about mornings at Whitcombe Estate. She looked at the garden. She looked at him. She thought about a blueprint signed with love, and a letter in a binding, and a December terrace with lanterns, and the long, patient work of two people learning to be in the same life together, without either of them disappearing into the other. She thought about her father's archive and the smell of old paper and the way he had always said the same thing when she brought him a finished restoration. There it is. There it always was. She had been carrying that phrase for years, without fully understanding it, without understanding that it applied not only to documents, but to people. That the person worth finding was always already there inside the damage and the distance, and the careful management of a life that had been lived for everyone except the person living it. She had been there. She had always been there. So had he. "Come inside," he said. "Mrs. Aldrin has strong opinions about cold tea. She has strong opinions about everything." "Yes, that's what makes her excellent at her work." Eleanor laughed, the real, unguarded laugh that she had stopped managing somewhere in the months that followed December. The one that came when something was genuinely funny, and the room felt safe enough to let it be heard. He looked at her when she laughed. He always looked at her when she laughed with the specific expression of someone who has been given something they did not know they needed until they received it. She took his arm. They walked back through the gate together into the estate, through the corridors where the portraits had been uncovered, and the rooms had been opened, and the vase near the entrance. She had filled it herself the previous spring, with roses from the west wall, held flowers that were real and present and chosen for no reason, except that they were beautiful and the house deserved them. Outside the Whitcombe grounds lay in their April light, the East Garden in its second full expression, the academy workrooms in the west wing, with their north-facing light and the sound of students working the kitchen garden, the old brick edging at the corner of the parterre where a child had once sat and talked to his mother while she worked. Inside, a life was being lived, not preserved, not performed, not managed for the benefit of an audience that had long since revised its understanding of what it was observing. Simply lived, fully honestly, with the specific warmth of people who had found each other in a damaged place and had done the patient necessary, entirely worthwhile work of restoration. There it was. There it had always been, waiting the way. Things wait when they have already decided to grow and are simply gathering the warmth required to begin.